Hey there, tonight we're uncovering why it truly sucked to be a Roman legionary. What you're about to discover isn't the glory-filled epic you might expect, but a grueling reality of blisters, boredom, and brutal discipline. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. So you're eyeing a spot in the Roman legions. Maybe you've heard tales of glory and grandeur, of marching in unison beneath the standard, a sea of disciplined ranks, and the Roman eagle leading the charge. But let's cut to the chase. Being a legionary wasn't all laurel wreaths and triumphant parades. It was more like grueling drills, uncomfortable armor, and a lot of walking. Think of it as an ancient version of the Tough Mudder, except it lasted 25 years, and the mud was mixed with, well, let's just say questionable substances. Let's rewind to the recruitment process. Forget the romanticized enlistment scenes from Hollywood. The truth is, you didn't just stroll into a recruitment office, sign on the dotted line, and get handed a shiny sword. Nope, the Romans had standards. You needed to be a male Roman citizen, typically between the ages of 17 and 46, although most recruits were in their late teens or early 20s. If you were too short or too frail, you'd likely be shown the door. They weren't looking for the next gladiator superstar. They wanted durability over drama. Now, here's a twist. Some of those eager young men weren't exactly chomping at the bit to join. Economic necessity was a powerful motivator. Picture this. You're a poor farmer struggling to make ends meet. The Roman economy isn't exactly booming, and your family's barely scraping by. Enter the Roman army, offering a steady wage of 225 denarii a year. That might sound like chump change in modern terms, but back then it was a lifeline. It sure beat watching your crops wither and your debts grow. Still, don't start imagining a life of luxury with that pay. Most of it went straight back into the essentials: food, basic clothing, and taxes. The reality was gritty. In fact, you'd be lucky to save any coins for a rainy day, let alone send some home to Ma and Pa. Despite the rough conditions, the promise of steady income and the occasional plunder was enough to lure many down this path. What about the motives beyond money? There was the allure of Roman citizenship for non-citizens. A full 25 years of service could earn you that coveted status if you weren't already a citizen. It was the ancient version of a green card, offering a shot at a better life, or at least a say in the local elections. And then there was the not-so-subtle pressure from society. Who didn't want to be the guy who came back to town in full military regalia, turning heads and earning nods of respect? But let's not kid ourselves. Most folks were more concerned with survival than swagger. The legionary life was a mixed bag of incentives and deterrents. While the prospect of a regular wage was tempting, the terms of service were anything but lenient. A 25-year commitment, with retirement benefits that might include a plot of land and a modest pension, was a long haul. Imagine signing up today for a job that requires a quarter-century of your life without the perks of job hopping or a robust LinkedIn profile. And if you thought the physical standards were tough, just wait until you hear about the discipline. Roman legions were no place for slackers or rebels. They had a reputation to uphold, and the punishments for stepping out of line were, shall we say, less than forgiving. We're talking decimation, the delightful practice of executing one in every 10 soldiers in a mutinous unit. It wasn't just a threat, it was a brutal reality. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The point is, once you were in deep. Joining the legions was not a decision made lightly. It was a leap into a life of strict discipline, long marches, and battles that could make or break you. Yet, for those who braved the challenges, it offered a chance to rise above their circumstances, to earn a place in the storied ranks of Roman history, even if it meant enduring a fair share of hardships along the way. So with all the facts laid bare, would you still sign on the dotted line, knowing what truly awaited you on the other side of glory. Well, if you're still with me, let's step into the day-to-day of a Roman legionary. Spoiler alert. It wasn't all marching to the beat of glory. If you thought joining the legions was like signing up for a 25-year vacation with a side of swordplay, think again. Welcome to camp reality, where the daily grind was more about grit than grandeur. Let's dive into the schedule of your average Roman soldier. Forget the drama of Hollywood battles. The real action was in the routine, dictated by a little something called the duty roster. And oh boy, did it keep you busy. Picture this. You wake up at the crack of dawn, not to the sound of a bugle, but to the bark of your centurion. The day kicks off with a hearty breakfast of pools, a sort of ancient oatmeal, minus the maple syrup and Instagram appeal. Once your belly's full, or at least no longer empty, it's time for drills. Imagine school gym class, but instead of dodgeball, you're perfecting formations and weapon maneuvers with a gladius, the short sword that was more workaday than warrior's trophy. These drills weren't just for show. They were meticulous, repetitive, and designed to make sure you didn't drop your shield or trip over your own feet in battle. Roman discipline was legendary, and for good reason. The centurions, those grizzled veterans with more scars than stories, made sure you got it right. Slip up, and you'd face the wrath of decimation's little brother, flogging. Not exactly a motivational poster moment, but it got results. But wait, there's more. When you weren't busy perfecting your combat skills, you were building stuff. Lots of stuff. Roads, forts, aqueducts, you name it, they built it. The Roman Empire didn't just conquer, it constructed. Every time the legions moved, they left behind a trail of engineering marvels. Roman roads, like the famed Via Appia, weren't just for troop movements. They revolutionized trade and communication. And who do you think laid those stones? That's right, our friends the legionaries. They were more skilled masons than warriors at times, with calloused hands to prove it. Speaking of roads, here's a fun fact. The Romans built over 80,000 kilometers of them. That's like paving a path twice around the earth. And doing it while wearing armor. Talk about heavy lifting. Each legionary was expected to carry around 30 kilograms of equipment on the march, including weapons, armor, and a few days' worth of rations. It was like hiking the Appalachian Trail with a medieval twist. Now, let's talk about the camps. Each night, after a long day of marching or construction, you'd set up a temporary fort. This wasn't a casual pitch-your-tent affair. Every camp was a fortified base, complete with ditches, ramparts, and palisades. The Romans didn't just plop down anywhere. They scouted for defensible locations, ensured ample water supply, and laid out the camp in a precise grid. It was military urban planning at its finest. The catch: you were the one digging those ditches and hauling those logs. Glamorous, right? And just when you thought you could rest, there was guard duty. Roman camps were like a well-oiled machine, and every soldier had a role. Forget lounging around the campfire swapping tales of valor. You were more likely to be patrolling the perimeter, keeping an eye out for potential threats. Vigilance was key, and the Romans had no patience for slackers. Falling asleep on duty could get you executed. No pressure. So why did the Romans go to such great lengths? Simple: security and efficiency. By keeping the troops busy, disciplined, and well-prepared, they maintained control and cohesion. An idle army is a rebellious army, after all. And let's not forget the economic angle. The Roman state got a lot of bang for its buck, with the legions doubling as construction crews. Those roads and aqueducts paid dividends in terms of trade and infrastructure long after the legions had moved on. Now, if you're wondering about downtime, don't worry. There was some, albeit limited. Soldiers could enjoy a game of tabula, an ancestor of backgammon, or indulge in some wine, rationed of course. But this wasn't a frat party. Discipline and order were the names of the game. Even leisure needed to feel productive. So there you have it. Life in a Roman camp wasn't about basking in glory. It was about surviving the grind. The legionaries were tough, resourceful, and more than a little overworked. They were the backbone of an empire, laying the literal groundwork for Rome's expansion. Their lives were dictated by duty, not desire, and their days were filled with hard labor, strict discipline, and an occasional brush with danger. Not quite the picture-perfect warrior life, but hey, it kept the empire running and maybe even built a few legends along the way. As for the glory, that was just a well-spun tale to keep morale high and enlistment numbers up. Stay tuned for more on how these soldiers turned mundane into monumental in the next part of our journey. Now, as we leave the confines of the Roman camp, it's time to hit the open road, or rather, an expansive network of Roman roads. Marching across the Roman Empire sounds like a grand adventure, doesn't it? Endless horizons, the call of the unknown, and all that jazz. But let me stop you right there. The reality was more like a grueling commute, with no cushy seats or air conditioning in sight. You see, this wasn't a leisurely stroll through the Italian countryside. It was a logistical nightmare wrapped in a workout regimen that would put a triathlete to shame. First off, let's talk about the delightful gear you'd be lugging around. Each legionary was expected to carry around 90 pounds of equipment. That's like toting a small human on your back, and no, you don't get to switch shoulders every mile. The load included your trusty gladius, a pilum, a heavy javelin, a shield, a helmet, and armor, none of which were known for their ergonomic design. Add to that your personal kit of a cloak, cooking pot, and a few days' worth of rations. It's a miracle they had any energy left to fight after hauling that lot over mountains and through marshes. And about those roads, while Roman engineering was top-notch, with 80,000 kilometers of roads crisscrossing the empire, they weren't exactly gentle on the feet. Think miles of stone slabs, designed more for durability than comfort. If you're picturing a leisurely amble, think again. The average marching speed was about 20 miles a day. That's right, 20 miles, just shy of a marathon every single day. The legionaries didn't have the luxury of Fitbit goals. Their motivation was more about avoiding a centurion's wrath than burning calories. Speaking of centurions, these guys were the drill sergeants of the ancient world. They kept the march in line, literally and figuratively. The Romans were sticklers for discipline, and even on the move, formations were tight and precise. There was no room for stragglers, and if you fell behind, well, let's just say you wouldn't be enjoying the view for long. Now, why such breakneck marching speeds and rigid formations? It all boils down to logistics and survival. Supply lines were the lifeblood of the Roman army. While the legions carried a few days' worth of rations, the bulk of their food and supplies came from what could be requisitioned or purchased along the way. Delays weren't just inconvenient. They were dangerous. An army marches on its stomach, after all, and keeping it fed was a Herculean task. The Romans were masters of organization. They had a system of granaries and depots strategically placed across the empire. But even the best-laid plans could falter, especially in hostile or unfamiliar territory. This is where the Roman talent for improvisation came into play. If supplies ran low, soldiers had to be resourceful, living off the land, foraging, or, more often than not, taking what they needed from local populations. It was exactly the Roman charm offensive, but it kept the legions moving. As for the glamour of ancient warfare, let's peel back that glossy veneer. Battles were chaotic, brutal affairs where luck often trumped skill. Sure, you had your training and your gear, but once the dust and adrenaline kicked in, it was every man for himself. The Romans were famed for their discipline and tactics, but even the best formations could crumble under the chaos of conflict. It's one thing to practice maneuvers on a drill field. It's another to execute them amidst the clamor of clashing swords and screaming men. Survival in battle was as much about being in the right place at the right time as it was about martial prowess. The front lines were the most dangerous, but retreating wasn't an option. Roman soldiers were expected to hold their ground, and turning tail could mean facing harsher consequences from your comrades than from the enemy. Courage was often a matter of necessity, not choice. So, what kept the legions going in the face of such odds? Part of it was the promise of spoils. Conquering new territories meant access to loot, land, and glory, or at least the hope of it. But more practically, it was about camaraderie and collective resilience. The bonds forged in the shared hardship of army life were as strong as the shields they carried. These men weren't just fighting for Rome, they were fighting for each other. And yet, for all their hardships, the legionaries were part of something larger than themselves, a sprawling empire that, at its height, stretched from Britain to North Africa and from Spain to the Middle East. Their efforts laid the foundation for roads, cities, and infrastructures that would outlast the empire itself. It wasn't always glorious, but it was undeniably monumental. As we continue our march through this historical landscape, remember that the grandeur of the Roman Empire was built on the backs of these soldiers. They weren't just pawns in an imperial game. They were the sinews of Roman might, driven by a mix of duty, hope, and the sheer necessity of survival. Stay with me as we unravel more of their world in the next part of our journey. Now, as we press deeper into the life of a Roman legionary, let's not sugarcoat it. The psychological toll was as relentless as a Roman march. Picture this. You're in the thick of a campaign, far from home, surrounded by the constant drumbeat of potential conflict. It's not just the physical grind that wears you down. It's the ever-present cloud of war looming over your head like an ominous Roman arch. The threats were everywhere, from the barbarian tribes lurking at the fringes of the empire to the political machinations back in Rome. The stakes were high, and the cost of failure was often a swift, brutal end. It wasn't just the enemy you had to worry about. The Roman army had its own brand of internal dangers. Disobeying orders or showing cowardice could land you in hot water, or worse, 6 feet under. Let's talk about the infamous practice of decimation. This was no idle threat. It was a chilling reality for soldiers who faltered. If a unit was deemed cowardly or mutinous, every 10th man could be executed as punishment. It was a strategy as ruthless as it was effective, ensuring that fear kept the ranks in line. Imagine standing in formation, counting down the line, knowing that a lottery of death could determine your fate. It's a grim game of chance that would make even the bravest soldier's stomach churn. And then there was the hierarchy. Roman legions weren't exactly flat organizations. The chain of command was rigid, with centurions wielding the kind of authority that could make or break a soldier's day or life. The centurions were the backbone of Roman discipline, and they didn't earn their stripes by being soft. These were battle-hardened veterans, their leadership marked by the scars of past campaigns. They enforced the rules with an iron fist, often literally. A slip-up could earn you a flogging, a punishment that was as public as it was painful. But before you start picturing these centurions as heartless overlords, remember that they were also the glue holding the legions together. Their experience and leadership were invaluable, and many soldiers owed their lives to a centurion's quick decision-making in the chaos of battle. It was a harsh, but necessary system, a bit like the world's toughest boot camp, except the stakes weren't just a stern talking to, but life and death. Amidst this strict discipline and ever-present threat of violence, camaraderie became a lifeline. These men lived, fought, and died together, forging bonds stronger than the finest Roman steel. The legionary tent, or contubernium, housed 8 soldiers, and these tentmates became brothers-in-arms. They shared everything from meals to battle scars, and this close-knit living arrangement was both a necessity and a comfort. When you're facing the constant spectre of death, knowing someone has your back can be the difference between making it through the night or not. The legions were a melting pot of cultures and backgrounds, with soldiers hailing from all corners of the Roman world. This diversity was a strength, bringing together a mix of skills, languages, and traditions. But it also meant learning to navigate differences and build trust across cultural lines. It wasn't always easy, but the shared struggle against common foes created a unity that transcended local allegiances. In this brotherhood, humor was a vital coping mechanism. Dark jokes about the absurdities of military life were as common as the blisters on a legionary's feet. It said that laughter is the best medicine, and for these soldiers, it was often the only escape from the harsh realities of their existence. Cracking a joke about the centurion's bark or the endless march could lift spirits, even if just for a moment. Yet, The psychological toll didn't end with the threat of battle or the rigidity of military life. There was the constant pressure of living up to the Roman ideal, the expectation to be a model of strength, courage, and discipline. Failure wasn't just a personal disappointment, it was a stain on the honor of Rome itself. The weight of this expectation was immense, and it sat heavily on every soldier's shoulders, alongside their 30 kilograms of gear. The economic realities also played a role in the emotional strain. That steady wage we talked about earlier. It was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided security and a sense of purpose. On the other, it was a reminder of the precariousness of life outside the legions. Many soldiers joined out of necessity, leaving behind struggling families who depended on their pay. The pressure to send money home was constant, and the fear of what might happen if they didn't was a shadow that followed them into every battle. Even as they were stretched to their limits, these soldiers were part of something monumental. They were the living embodiment of Roman power, the enforcers of an empire that spanned continents. This sense of purpose, of being a cog in the great Roman machine, was both a comfort and a burden. It gave their struggles meaning, but it also tied them to a system that demanded everything and gave little in return. And yet, for all the hardships and heartaches, many legionaries look back on their service with a sense of pride. They were part of a legacy, builders of an empire whose roads, laws, and culture would shape the world for centuries to come. The tangible achievements of their sweat and blood, those roads, aqueducts, and cities, were lasting monuments to their sacrifice. So, as we continue to explore this world of iron and discipline, remember that the glory of Rome was built not on the backs of legends, but on the weary shoulders of men who, despite everything, took up their swords and marched on. They weren't just fighting enemies. They were battling the grind of relentless pressure and the harsh realities of their time. Stay tuned, because there's more to uncover about how these soldiers persevered amidst the weight of empire, duty, and the human condition. So as our legionary story marches toward its conclusion, let's step out of the combat boots and into the not-so-golden sandals of retirement. After 25 years of grueling service, you might think a Roman legionary would finally kick back, basking in the glow of well-earned rest. Think again. Retirement for many was less about sipping wine under the Italian sun and more about navigating the thorns of promised land grants. Sure, the Roman state dangled land as a carrot for your years of service, but reality often served up more of a wilted salad than a bountiful harvest. Let's dive into the nitty-gritty of these post-service perks. A legionary who made it to retirement, an achievement in itself, was often granted a parcel of land, typically in frontier provinces. This wasn't a penthouse in Rome or a villa on the Mediterranean coast. No, these plots were frequently located in the hinterlands, the kind of places maps label as "here be dragons," or more realistically, "here be barbarians." The idea was that these ex-soldiers would act as a buffer, a living shield between the empire's heartlands and its more unruly edges. Think of it as Rome's version of a witness protection program, only you're protecting Rome. Now, owning land sounds fantastic in theory, but it came with a catch. The land needed to be cultivated. Most legionaries weren't exactly green-thumbed farmers. They'd spent their best years perfecting the art of war, not agriculture. So the transition from swinging a gladius to swinging a plough was, to say the least, jarring. Add to this the financial burden of setting up a farm from scratch, and you've got a recipe for stress rather than success. Many found themselves struggling to transform these plots into productive farms, with some opting to sell or lease their land, if they could. Economically, the situation was a double-edged sword. While land ownership was a mark of status, the reality was that the costs of turning that land into a viable source of income often outweighed the benefits. Tools, seeds, livestock, these didn't come cheap, and unless you had a stash of denarii saved from your service days, you might find yourself in a bind. For some, the promised land turned out to be more of a burden than a boon, leading to financial strain, and in some cases, selling the land back to wealthier Romans or local elites. The dream of pastoral peace often ended in a return to the economic struggle that drove many to enlist in the first place. Despite these harsh realities, the image of the retired legionary remains one of enduring mythic proportions. Why? Well, Rome was nothing if not a master of narrative. The stories of valiant soldiers returning to peaceful lives of prosperity were woven into the fabric of Roman culture, reinforcing the idea of the soldier hero. This narrative served the state well, encouraging new recruits to step up and fill the ranks, perpetuating the cycle. The romanticized vision of the legionary, a warrior-turned-landowner, respected and revered, appealed not just to those in service, but to the broader Roman populace. It was a story of upward mobility, a rags-to-riches tale that made excellent propaganda. The reality, with its dirt and debt, wasn't as glamorous, but it was a potent motivator. It's a classic case of selling the sizzle, not the steak. And then there's the legacy factor. The Roman legions, with their discipline and engineering feats, left behind an infrastructure that was nothing short of monumental. Roads, bridges, and aqueducts, these weren't just relics of military expeditions. They were the foundation of an empire's economy and communication network. For many legionaries, their service was a chance to be part of something bigger than themselves, to contribute to a legacy that would echo through history. It's no wonder that this collective achievement has been wrapped in a cloak of legend. The enduring myth of the Roman legionary persists because it taps into something fundamentally human, the desire for recognition, for our struggles to mean something. While the reality was often grittier than the stories suggest, the myth endures, offering a glimpse of hope and heroism amidst hardship. The allure of the noble soldier, sacrificing for the greater good and reaping rewards in later life, continues to captivate our imaginations. As we wrap up this deep dive into legionary life, let's remember that these soldiers were the backbone of Rome's imperial might. They were architects of an empire, not just through their conquests, but through the roads and cities they built, the cultures they influenced, and the history they shaped. Their lives were far from easy, but they were undeniably impactful. So, next time you hear tales of Roman glory, remember the legionaries who walked those endless roads, fought those battles, and yes, tried to farm those stubborn plots of land. Ultimately, the story of the Roman legionary is a testament to resilience and endurance. It's about ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, grappling with the demands of empire while dreaming of peace and prosperity. Their lives were a mix of myth and reality, hardship and heroism, grounded in the very human quest for purpose and place. And that, dear listener, is a legacy worth remembering. Vasco da Gama, the man who strolled into history books with the swagger of a rock star and the ambition of a startup founder, was not your average sailor. Born around 1460 in the sleepy town of Sines, Portugal, he grew up in an era when a good spice rack was the ultimate status symbol. Back then, if you wanted to be the Bill Gates of the 15th century, you needed to corner the market on cloves, pepper, and cinnamon. But those spices weren't just sitting there on the shelves of your local medieval grocery store. Nope, they were thousands of miles away in the mystic lands of India, guarded by sill-crapped middlemen who charged premiums that would make today's tech giants blush. Now, why was Portugal, a country about the size of Indiana, so desperate to bypass these middlemen? Well, let's talk about economics, medieval style. You see, Europe was hooked on spices like a caffeine-addicted college student during finals. Spices were more than just a culinary delight. They were preservatives, medicines, and even status symbols. A pinch of pepper could buy you a nice plot of land, and nutmeg was worth more than gold. But getting these spices involved a convoluted game of telephone that started in the east and made its way through a maze of traders, each adding their own markup. By the time the goods reached Europe, the prices had been inflated more than a real estate bubble. Enter Portugal, the scrappy underdog of Europe, with dreams bigger than its coastline. The Portuguese crown, led by King John II and his successor Manuel I, decided it was high time to cut out the middlemen and sail directly to the source. And who better to spearhead this audacious plan than Vasco da Gama, a man with salt water in his veins and a map of the stars in his head. But let's not romanticize maritime exploration as a breezy ocean cruise. Setting sail on a voyage of discovery was less like a vacation and more like signing up for a medieval reality show with high stakes and no guarantee of survival. Imagine pitching this idea. Hey, let's spend a fortune building ships, hire hundreds of sailors who may or may not know how to swim, and then send them into the unknown with nothing but hope and a few questionable maps. Oh, and did I mention the budget? The cost of outfitting de Gama's fleet was astronomical, equivalent to the GDP of a small country. And while today we might throw money at a Kickstarter campaign for a gadget that slices and dices, back then, Portugal was essentially crowdfunding an armada. The logistics were a nightmare even the most seasoned project manager would refuse. De Gama's expedition covered 27,000 miles of uncharted ocean, a distance that makes the average road trip look like a leisurely stroll. They were navigating by the stars, with maps that might as well have been drawn by a child with a crayon, and let's not forget the ever-present threat of scurvy, a disease that could turn your gums into a horror show faster than you could say citrus deficiency. Despite the odds, de Gama was chosen for his reputation, which, to be fair, was a mixed bag. Some sources say he was a brilliant navigator, others hint at a temper that would fit right in with today's reality TV stars. Regardless, he was the man for the job, and in July 1497 he set sail from Lisbon with 4 ships that were more like floating coffins than luxury liners. These vessels, the São Gabriel, São Rafael, Berrio, and a humble storeship, were packed with enough supplies to feed an army and enough cannonballs to start a small war. As the fleet departed, Vasco da Gama wasn't just charting a course for India. He was navigating the treacherous waters of political ambition, economic desperation, and the human thirst for adventure. Portugal was betting big on this voyage, hoping it would open the floodgates to a new era of trade and prosperity. It was a gamble with stakes higher than the crow's nest on de Gama's flagship, but it was one they were willing to take. After all, in the race for spices, there were no participation trophies, only glory or obscurity. And so, armed with a royal decree, a crew of brave souls, and a compass that probably only worked half the time, Vasco da Gama set his sights on the horizon. Little did he know, he was about to make history, not just by reaching India, but by proving that the ocean wasn't a barrier. It was a highway waiting to be conquered. And so, da Gama and his merry band of adventurers, who were more like unwilling participants in history's most extreme team-building exercise, sailed into the unknown. The early parts of their journey were like a bizarre blend of fear factor and survivor, with a touch of the office thrown in for good measure. Picture the crew, crammed on ships about as comfortable as a budget airline middle seat, setting sail with maps that were just a notch above a doodle on a cocktail napkin. These maps, courtesy of armchair geographers who were probably better at storytelling than cartography, were riddled with inaccuracies. Imagine trying to navigate the cosmos with a guide that insisted the Earth was flat. By the time the fleet reached the African coast, the romance of exploration was getting overshadowed by the reality of survival. The first stop was the Canary Islands, a known waypoint since ancient times, but still, it was a place to stretch their legs and maybe indulge in some local hospitality. This, however, was just the calm before the storm, as da Gama and his crew soon discovered. As they ventured further south along the west coast of Africa, things got tricky, and I don't just mean the weather. The African coast was a place where the stakes were life and death, and the misunderstandings were often comedic in their absurdity. Take their encounter with the local tribes near modern-day Sierra Leone. Armed with gifts and good intentions, or what passed for them in the 15th century, da Gama's crew attempted to trade. But cultural gaps were wider than the Atlantic, and hand gestures that might have meant hello in Lisbon seemed more like get lost to the tribes. Mistranslations could escalate faster than a Twitter feud, and da Gama soon learned that diplomacy required more than just a smile and a handshake. As they sailed further, the dubious maps led to even more dubious decisions. In true cartographic comedy, One map famously depicted a sea monster lurking off the coast of Africa. Now, the reality of the sea monster was questionable at best, but when you're stuck on a wooden ship for months on end, you're willing to believe anything might pop out of the ocean. It didn't help that the crew's morale was sinking faster than a lead anchor. With the fresh sea breeze came scurvy, the sailors' worst enemy, which crept up on them like an unwelcome house guest. Scurvy, the great equalizer, didn't care if you were an admiral or a deckhand. It was the grim reaper of the sea, turning gums into bleeding messes and sailors into ghosts of their former selves. The lack of fresh produce on board meant that vitamin C was as elusive as a unicorn, and the crew soon found themselves grumbling more than a Monday morning office crowd without coffee. The reality of maritime exploration was a hard pill to swallow, and without citrus, it was a bitter one too. But the hardships didn't end with scurvy. Gama's leadership skills were put to the test as his crew began to question their mission's purpose. Imagine trying to maintain morale when your only entertainment was the occasional sighting of a dolphin or a particularly well-formed cloud. It wasn't long before the sailors, who had signed up with dreams of gold and glory, started to resemble disgruntled employees trapped in a never-ending corporate retreat. Gama, though, was not one to be deterred. His determination was as unyielding as the waves that battered his ships. He knew that turning back wasn't an option, not when the entire Portuguese economy was betting on his success. He had to play the role of motivator, navigator, and sometimes disciplinarian. He was leading what was essentially a floating experiment in human endurance, and the stakes were higher than the crow's nest on his flagship. Yet, as they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, aptly named for the hope it inspired in weary sailors, things took a turn for the better, or so they thought. The Cape was notorious for its tempestuous weather, a place where the ocean seemed to have a personal vendetta against ships. But Gama and his fleet, battered and bruised, managed to navigate through, marking a significant milestone in their journey. It was a moment of triumph, a glimmer of light in an otherwise grueling expedition. However, the African coast still had surprises in store. As they sailed up the eastern coast, they encountered the thriving trade cities of East Africa, places like Mozambique and Mombasa, which were bustling with merchants from all over the Indian Ocean. These were cities that played by their own rules, where the blend of cultures was as rich as the spices they traded. But Gama's crew, with their European mindset and limited understanding of local customs, often found themselves at odds with the local populace. In Mozambique, for instance, Gama's attempts to establish friendly relations were met with suspicion. The local ruler, wary of these strange newcomers, wasn't eager to open his doors to potential competitors. Misunderstandings brewed, leading to tensions that could have boiled over into conflict. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy, one that required Gama to tread carefully between assertiveness and respect. As the journey continued, the crew's living conditions didn't improve much. The ships, which had been their home for months, were cramped and claustrophobic. Supplies were dwindling, and the spectre of scurvy loomed large. The daily grind of maintaining the ship, coupled with the lack of fresh food and clean water, was taking its toll. Yet, despite the hardships, the crew pressed on, driven by the promise of riches and the allure of the unknown. And so, with the African coast behind them and the promise of India ahead, Vasco da Gama and his crew sailed into the annals of history. They had faced storms, sickness, and the constant threat of mutiny, but they had also experienced moments of discovery and wonder. It was a journey that tested the limits of human endurance and reshaped the world in ways they could scarcely imagine. The open sea had been their adversary, but it was also their pathway to greatness. With the African coast fading in their wake, Vasco da Gama and his crew could almost taste the spices that had lured them across tumultuous seas and treacherous coasts. They were on the verge of a historic encounter that would resonate through time like a well-struck gong. It was May 20, 1498, when da Gama's fleet finally anchored off the Malabar coast, gazing upon the bustling port of Calicut, present-day Kozhikode. The air was thick with anticipation, and let's be honest, probably a bit of body odor after months at sea. Now, Calicut wasn't just any port. It was the epicenter of the spice trade, the Wall Street of the Indian Ocean, where fortunes were made and lost faster than you could say peppercorn. For centuries, Arab, Chinese, and Indian merchants had mingled here, trading everything from silk to sapphires. The Gama and his crew, however, were about to crash this party with all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop, or more fittingly, a European in a silk market. Stepping onto Indian soil must have felt like landing on another planet. Picture this: the Gama, in his European garb, sticking out like a sore thumb amid the kaleidoscope of local attire. He was an ambassador with no training beyond the art of not getting lost at sea. The Portuguese had come with gifts they thought would impress: 24 cloaks, 6 hats, 4 branches of coral, 12 alms dish basins, and a chest of sugar. This might have dazzled the courts of Lisbon, but in Calicut it was like presenting a fast food coupon at a Michelin star restaurant. The Zamorin, the ruler of Calicut, was no pushover. He was used to dealing with seasoned traders, not maritime rookies. According to accounts, the Gama's offerings were met with a bemused smile and perhaps a diplomatic chuckle. The Zamorins' court, accustomed to receiving lavish gifts from the affluent merchants of the East, found the Portuguese trinkets more quaint than impressive. It was a bit like bringing a toaster to a potluck dinner when everyone else had brought caviar. But Da Gama was undeterred. He was a man on a mission, and if his gifts didn't impress, maybe his words would. Unfortunately, Da Gama's people skills were about as polished as a rusty anchor. Historical accounts suggest he approached diplomacy with the finesse of a charging rhinoceros. In one vivid anecdote, Da Gama was recorded as saying, "We come in search of Christians and spices." Not exactly the smoothest opening line in the annals of diplomacy. It might have worked in the courts of Europe, but in Calicut it was as effective as trying to sell popsicles in Antarctica. Language barriers only added to the comedy of errors. The Portuguese relied on a pair of interpreters they picked up along the way, who spoke a mix of Arabic and some Indian languages. This led to miscommunications that could have been lifted straight out of a sitcom. When Da Gama tried to explain their mission, what the Zamorin might have heard was anyone's guess. A request for spices could have been interpreted as a question about the local weather for all they knew. Still, Da Gama did manage to secure a meeting with the Zamorin, and it was here that the cultural collision reached its peak. The Portuguese were eager to prove their worth as trading partners, but their lack of experience in Eastern trade showed. They attempted to negotiate trade agreements with a confidence that was admirable, if not entirely justified. The Zamorin, with the patience of a seasoned ruler, listened to their proposals but remained non-committal. After all, he had a prosperous trade network already in place, and he wasn't about to overhaul it for a group of strangers who seemed more lost than found. Despite these setbacks, Da Gama's journey was not without its triumphs. He had achieved what many had deemed impossible: a direct sea route to India, bypassing the Middle Eastern and Venetian middlemen who had long controlled the spice trade. This was a game changer, and Da Gama knew it. He was like a poker player who had just gone all in and come out on top, not by bluffing, but by sheer audacity and persistence. The Portuguese had broken into the exclusive club of Indian Ocean trade, even if they were still fumbling with the handshake. But success didn't come without its share of blunders. Da Gama's lack of diplomatic finesse and cultural understanding left a mixed legacy. His approach to negotiations was more suited to a battlefield than a marketplace, and his interactions with the local population ranged from awkward to outright hostile. In one instance, Da Gama reportedly seized a group of local merchants as hostages when negotiations stalled, a move that surely won him no popularity contests in Calicut. Despite these missteps, Da Gama's voyage was a landmark event. It kicked open the door for European imperialism in Asia, for better or worse. The Portuguese, with Da Gama leading the charge, were about to rewrite the rules of global trade, even if they sometimes seemed to be using a pen with no ink. They had set the stage for a new era of exploration and exploitation, a fact that was not lost on the powers of Europe. Back home, Da Gama was hailed as a hero. his journey celebrated as a triumph of navigation and endurance. The King of Portugal rewarded him handsomely, perhaps overlooking the diplomatic debacles in favor of the economic potential his voyage unlocked. Da Gama's arrival in Calicut was a moment of both triumph and tragedy, a testament to human ambition and the inevitable clash of cultures that accompanies it. It was a story of daring and discovery, but also of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. The Portuguese had come seeking spices and wealth, and they found them, albeit with a few bumps along the way. Yet the legacy of Da Gama's voyage is a reminder that exploration is as much about the journey as the destination, and that sometimes the greatest discoveries are the lessons learned along the way. And so, as Da Gama and his crew prepared to return to Portugal, they carried with them not just the spices they had sought, but the seeds of a new global order. They had navigated uncharted waters, both literally and figuratively, and in doing so, they had changed the world. Yet, the story was far from over. The voyage back would present its own challenges, and the repercussions of their journey were just beginning to unfold. As Da Gama's fleet set sail for home, they left behind a world forever altered by their presence, a world that would never be the same again. As Vasco da Gama's fleet set sail from Calicut, the horizon was anything but a promise of smooth sailing and champagne toasts. The outbound journey had been a masterclass in maritime endurance, but the return trip would test their resolve like a final exam with surprise questions. The Indian Ocean, kind on the approach, had no intentions of being a passive observer on the way back. Let's talk numbers for a moment. The journey back to Portugal was another 13,000 miles, give or take. That's roughly the distance of circling the globe at the equator, with only the stars and an unreliable compass to guide you. And if you thought the outbound trip was fraught with peril, you ain't seen nothing yet. Da Gama and his crew faced storms that would have sent chills down the spine of even the most hardened sailor. The monsoon winds, which had been their ally on the way over, turned into ferocious adversaries, hammering the ships with waves that towered like the ambitions of a young explorer. The fleet limped around the Cape of Good Hope, the same notorious point that had been a beacon of success on their way to India, now a menacing reminder of nature's unpredictability. By the time they reached the east coast of Africa again, the crew was more bedraggled than a group of cats caught in a rainstorm. Supplies were low, morale was lower, and scurvy was making its unwelcome encore appearance. The disease, still the nemesis of sailors everywhere, didn't care if you were a lowly deckhand or the captain himself. It was an equal opportunity affliction, and it took no prisoners. Deaths were inevitable, and with each loss, the spectre of mutiny loomed larger. Da Gama, for all his navigational prowess, was not exactly a morale-boosting motivational speaker. His leadership style was more tough love than team-building workshop, and at times more dictator than captain. But his steely determination was perhaps his greatest asset. He was the kind of guy who, even in a sinking ship, would be plotting how to swim to the nearest landmass with a smile, or at least a grimace, on his face. The fleet made sporadic stops along the African coast, each time hoping to replenish their dwindling supplies. But here's the twist. Not everyone was thrilled to see them. Some local rulers, still smarting from earlier encounters with these strange European visitors, were less than welcoming. The Portuguese often found themselves negotiating for food and water with the same charm they'd used to barter for spices. Not exactly a recipe for success. Finally, after what felt like an eternity at sea, the battered remains of Da Gama's fleet sighted the coast of Portugal in July 1499, 2 years after they had first set sail. They were greeted as heroes, the return of the prodigal sons. Da Gama's arrival back in Lisbon was akin to a ticker-tape parade, minus the confetti and marching bands. King Manuel I, who had been pacing the royal halls like an expectant father, was over the moon, or as close as you could get in a time before space travel. The economic consequences of Da Gama's expedition were immediate and profound. The direct sea route to India was a financial game changer, akin to discovering the cheat codes to the global economy. The Portuguese had effectively cut out the middlemen, those pesky Venetians and Ottomans who had been raking in profits like casino owners on a winning streak. Spices started flowing into Portugal like a culinary gold rush. Pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, once the exclusive domain of the elite, began to spice up the tables of those who could afford them. The Portuguese spice trade took off like a rocket, or as much as anything could in the 15th century. The economic boom was such that King Manuel I was soon styling himself as Lord of the Conquest, Navigation, and Commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India. A title with more grandeur than a royal wedding. But let's not pretend da Gama was sitting back on his laurels, sipping fine wine and basking in the glory. His first voyage was just the beginning. He would return to India on subsequent voyages, each more fraught with controversy than the last. Da Gama, it turns out, had a knack for making enemies wherever he went, and his methods were often more scorched earth than win hearts and minds. Here's where history gets a bit messy, and some textbooks suddenly develop selective amnesia. Da Gama's second voyage in 1502 was marked by an infamous incident at Calicut that would make even his most ardent supporters squirm. In a show of force, or perhaps a gross overreaction, da Gama captured a ship filled with Muslim pilgrims returning from Mecca. When negotiations for a ransom fell through, he ordered the ship set on fire, killing hundreds. It was a brutal act that cast a long shadow over his legacy, a stark reminder that the line between hero and villain is often drawn with a quill dipped in blood. Despite, or perhaps because of, his aggressive tactics, da Gama solidified Portugal's foothold in the Indian Ocean. He was appointed Viceroy of India in 1524, a role that sounds prestigious, but was more like being handed a ticking time bomb. He died in Cochin later that year, perhaps fittingly on Christmas Eve, leaving behind a legacy as complex as the man himself. Vasco da Gama's story is a tangled web of exploration, ambition, and ruthlessness. He was a man who bridged continents and cultures, but also burned bridges with abandon. His voyages reshaped the world, laying the groundwork for the age of exploration and the globalized world we live in today. But in doing so, he also set the stage for centuries of colonialism, exploitation, and conflict. As we look back on da Gama's legacy, we must do so with clear eyes and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths of history. He was a pioneer and a plunderer, a hero and a harbinger of darker times. His voyages were a testament to human curiosity and the insatiable desire for wealth and power. They remind us that exploration is not just about discovering new lands, but also about the choices we make and the paths we choose to take. And so, as we prepare to delve further into the story of Vasco da Gama, let's keep our wits sharp and our cynicism intact. There are more voyages to explore, more myths to debunk, and more truths to uncover. After all, history is a vast ocean, and we've only just begun to chart its depths. And so, as we sail deeper into the choppy waters of Vasco da Gama's legacy, let's set our sights on the long-term impact of his maritime escapades. Spoiler alert. It's a mixed bag, like finding out your favorite historical hero also happened to moonlight as a villain. Da Gama's voyages weren't just about pepper and cinnamon. They were the opening salvo in a global economic reshuffle that makes the modern stock market look like a game of Monopoly. First, let's talk trade winds, or rather, the whirlwind of trade da Gama ignited. By charting a sea route to India, he effectively flipped the script on the spice trade. Before da Gama, the spice route was a convoluted land-based relay race, with each trader passing the baton and adding their markup until those precious goods reached Europe. Think of it as the world's longest game of telephone, where the message is, spices are expensive by the end of the line. Da Gama's sea route was a straight shot, cutting out the middlemen and their price hikes. Portugal, that scrappy little underdog with a coastline smaller than a Hollywood starlet's ego, suddenly found itself sitting on a gold mine. The economic boom in Portugal was as explosive as a firecracker in a haystack. By 1500, Lisbon had transformed into a bustling hub of commerce, with spices flowing in like a flood and money pouring out like a broken ATM. The Portuguese crown was raking in profits that would make a Fortune 500 CEO weep with envy. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just about lining royal pockets. The ripple effects of da Gama's voyages were felt across Europe. Other nations, seeing the Portuguese success, were itching to get in on the action. Spain, England, the Netherlands, they all started sending their own fleets, eager to grab a piece of the spice pie. It was a global land grab, but on water. However, let's not sugarcoat this history lesson. With great profit comes great exploitation. Da Gama's voyages weren't just the dawn of global trade. They were the prelude to an era of colonialism that would stretch across continents like an imperialist game of risk. The Portuguese, emboldened by their newfound wealth, began to establish trading posts and colonies along the African and Indian coasts, often with all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. They weren't just trading spices. They were imposing their will, claiming territories, and sometimes doing so with methods that would make a pirate blush. Cultural exchanges, a euphemism for the sort of sharing that involves a lot more taking, were another result of these voyages. The Portuguese brought with them not just goods, but also their religion, language, and customs. The Jesuits followed in the wake of da Gama's ships, eager to convert the so-called heathens to Christianity, a noble idea to some, but to others, a cultural bulldozer. The spread of European influence was as much about ideology as it was about economy, creating a tapestry of cultural interactions that were as complex as they were controversial. But let's pause and reflect on the myths versus the realities of exploration. The romantic image of da Gama as a swashbuckling hero, bravely sailing into uncharted waters, is a narrative as enduring as it is misleading. Sure, he was a pioneer, but his voyages were driven by profit and power, not pure adventure. The cost was high, not just in terms of money, but in human lives. The sailors who perished from scurvy, the locals who suffered under colonial rule, the cultures that were irrevocably altered. These are the shadows that linger behind the bright tale of discovery. Yet, it's critical to acknowledge the advances. Da Gama's voyages opened the world up in ways that were previously unimaginable. They laid the groundwork for the age of exploration, a period that would see the world mapped, catalogued, and yes, often exploited. But it also ushered in an era of scientific discovery, technological advancement, and global connectivity. The world became a smaller place, a place where ideas, goods, and people could move across oceans as they never had before. Drawing modern parallels, da Gama's story is a testament to the timeless nature of human curiosity and ambition, traits that propel us forward but often at a cost. Today, we look to space with the same starry-eyed ambition that da Gama looked on the sea. The quest for knowledge, for new frontiers, for resources beyond our current reach, it's the same spirit, wrapped in different technology. But just as da Gama's voyages had consequences, so too will our modern explorations. They remind us that with every new horizon we chase, we must tread carefully, mindful of the footprints we leave behind. In wrapping up this tale of high seas and higher stakes, it's important to reflect on the true legacy of Vasco da Gama. He was a man of his time, driven by the desires and demands of his era. His voyages were both a triumph of human ingenuity and a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition. The world he helped shape is a testament to the power of exploration to transform societies, for better or worse. So, as we dock this historical journey, let's keep in mind that history, much like the ocean da Gama sailed, is vast, deep, and full of mysteries yet to be uncovered. It's a reminder that while we look to the past for answers, we must also question and learn from it. For in the end, the true voyage is not just about discovering new lands, but about understanding the stories they tell us about ourselves. In a world where the idea of rags to riches sounds like a fairy tale, Joan of Arc's story is more rags to divine mission. Born in 1412 in the tiny village of Domremy, smack dab in northeastern France, she was a peasant girl with more sheep than friends. Her life was about as glamorous as a mud puddle. and yet she managed to catapult herself onto the world stage. Picture this, a teenage shepherdess from a one-horse town claiming to hear voices from saints. It's as if a TikTok influencer suddenly announced they were running for president, and winning. The 100 Years' War, a bit of a misnomer since it lasted a grueling 116 years, was the messy backdrop for Joan's story. France was not exactly the picturesque land of baguettes and berets back then. It was more like a chaotic board game where England and France were in a perpetual state of your turn, my turn, with territories like Normandy and Aquitaine as the prize. By the time Joan entered the scene, England was occupying large chunks of northern France, including Paris. The French crown was in tatters, and the Dauphin Charles, our man in the hot seat, was trying to hold onto his throne with the tenacity of a cat clinging to a ledge. Domremy itself was a blip on the map, a place barely worth the ink. Its 200 or so residents lived simple, agrarian lives, eking out a living from the land. Joan's dad, Jacques d'Arc, was one of those salt-of-the-earth types, a farmer and occasional village official who was as far removed from court life as you could get. In today's terms, he was the equivalent of a small-town mayor, dealing with local disputes while keeping an eye on his livestock. The family wasn't destitute, but they weren't dressing in the latest Parisian fashions either. Their home was a modest affair, and Joan's wardrobe was strictly peasant chic. Now, let's talk about Joan's claim to fame, those divine voices. At the tender age of 13, Joan started hearing the saintly equivalent of a celestial conference call. Saints Michael, Catherine, and Margaret were the keynote speakers, and they had quite the message. They told her to support Charles VII and help drive out the English. This wasn't exactly the career path her parents had in mind. Imagine the dinner table conversation. So, how was your day, Joan? Oh, you know, just chatting with saints about saving France. Cue eye rolls and awkward silence. The absurdity of a teenage girl claiming divine guidance to save a nation wasn't lost on the people around her. Let's be real, if Joan were alive today, she'd probably be the subject of a viral meme or a satirical sketch on Saturday Night Live. Yet, in a time when superstition was as rampant as the bubonic plague, her claims weren't entirely dismissed. People were desperate for hope, and if it came in the form of a girl in a homespun dress, so be it. The economic disparity between Joan's life and the royal court's intrigues was like comparing a fast-food burger to a Michelin-starred meal. While Joan was tending sheep in fields, the French nobility were busy engaging in a game of thrones, literally. The court was a labyrinth of alliances, betrayals, and power plays. It was a place where a misplaced word could cost you your head, and where opulence was on full display. Gold-threaded garments, elaborate feasts, and intricate tapestries were the norm. Meanwhile, Joan's biggest luxury was probably a pair of sturdy shoes. The contrast between Joan's humble beginnings and her eventual rise is as stark as a before and after makeover. She was a nobody from nowhere, yet her conviction and charisma propelled her to the forefront of French politics. And let's not forget, she was illiterate. She couldn't read or write, but had a sharpness of mind that cut through the nonsense like a hot knife through butter. Joan's journey from Domremy to the royal court was nothing short of a miracle or madness, depending on whom you asked. She managed to convince a local garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, to back her mission, which was no small feat. This was a time when women were expected to know their place, and that place was certainly not in the strategy rooms of war. So, we have a teenage girl claiming divine intervention who somehow gains enough traction to meet the Dauphin himself. It's like a Cinderella story, but instead of a glass slipper, she had a sword and a mission from God. Joan of Arc wasn't just challenging the status quo, she was upending the entire chessboard. Her life was a series of improbable events strung together by sheer willpower and a dash of divine inspiration. In a world where peasants were expected to keep their heads down, Joan stood tall. Her story wasn't just about visions and victories. It was a testament to the power of belief. Whether you see her as a saint or a shrewd strategist, Joan of Arc remains a compelling figure who defied the odds and dared to dream big. Her Her journey from the fields of Domremy to the halls of power is a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary stories come from the most unlikely places. In a medieval world where reality often seemed stranger than fiction, Joan of Arc's rise to military leadership was like the ultimate plot twist in a drama that nobody saw coming. Picture this. It's 1429, and France is a nation teetering on the brink of collapse. The English were camped out like they owned the place, and the French morale was as low as a snake's belly. Enter Joan, the teenage peasant girl from Domremy, whose divine pep talk from the saints was about to give the Dauphin Charles VII the boost he desperately needed. Now meeting a king, or a wannabe king like Charles VII, was no small affair. Here was Joan, barely out of her teens, walking into the royal court with all the confidence of someone who didn't just have a plan, but a destiny. In March 1429, Joan finally got her audience with Charles. Picture the scene. A shabby court in Chinon, filled with nobles who probably smelled like they hadn't met a bath in weeks. Joan, however, was unfazed. She saw Charles through a sea of skeptical faces and claimed to recognize him instantly, despite his attempts to disguise himself among his courtiers. Talk about making an entrance. Charles was intrigued, perhaps because desperation makes you open to unconventional ideas, or maybe because Joan's reputation had preceded her. Either way, he decided to test her claims by sending her on a mission to Orleans, a city that had been under siege for months, with supplies dwindling and its defenders worn thin. The city was a key strategic point, and losing it would have been like handing the English the keys to the kingdom. Joan was about to become the unexpected hero in this grim saga. Now, let's pause for a moment and consider the absurdity of the situation. A teenager, with zero military experience, was about to lead armies in a brutal medieval war. It's the kind of story that would be laughed out of a modern military academy. But Joan had something that transcended experience, a charisma and conviction that rallied the troops like nothing else. She donned armor, custom-made for her, of course, and took up her banner, an iconic image that would be etched into history. The Siege of Orleans was not your romanticized tale of gallant knights and epic battles. It was a gritty, grueling affair. Medieval warfare was less about chivalry and more about who could endure the stench of unwashed soldiers longer. The logistics were a nightmare. Armies moved at a snail's pace, with supply lines that were more like supply trickles. Food was scarce, and hygiene was somewhere between non-existent and medieval torture. Yet despite the odds, Joan's presence injected new life into the beleaguered French forces. On April 29, 1429, Joan entered Orleans, and by May 8, the siege was lifted. The city was free, and Joan's reputation soared. Her success was a combination of factors: her unshakable belief, the morale boost she provided, and perhaps a bit of luck. The English were caught off guard, possibly thinking, "Who is this girl, and why are our experienced commanders failing?" The truth was, Joan's presence was a morale weapon more powerful than any trebuchet. But let's not sugarcoat this. Joan didn't single-handedly swing a sword and defeat the English army. The real battle was fought by seasoned soldiers who knew the terrain and had the tactical acumen. Joan's role was pivotal, but not in the way romantic tales would have you believe. She was the heart of the movement, the symbol of divine favor, and that was enough to tip the scales in France's favor. In the chaotic chess game of war, she was the queen who moved in unexpected ways. Propaganda played a massive role in Joan's story. Her victories were spun into tales of divine intervention, a narrative that both inspired the French and demoralized the English. It was medieval PR at its finest. The idea of a peasant girl chosen by God to lead France was a narrative too enticing to resist. It was a story that spread like wildfire, proving that in war, perception can be as important as reality. Joan's rise was nothing short of miraculous, but beneath the legend lay the gritty truths of medieval life. Armies marched not on glory, but on the backs of peasants who provided the bread and meat. Battles were decided not just by valor, but by who could keep their soldiers fed and their spirits up in the face of unspeakable hardships. Joan of Arc was a beacon of hope in a time when hope was in short supply. But she was also a product of the harsh realities and desperate times she lived in. Her story is a testament to the power of belief and the unpredictability of history. Joan's rise from shepherdess to military leader wasn't just a fluke. It was the result of a confluence of circumstances that only a turbulent era like the 100 Years' War could produce. She was a symbol, a leader, and an enigma wrapped in armor. As we continue to unravel her tale, remember that Joan's journey was as much about the people she inspired as it was about the battles she fought. Her legend was born in the muddy fields of France, where a teenage girl dared to change the course of history. So, as Joan's legend was still glowing brighter than a knight's freshly polished armor, the tides of fortune took a turn so sharp it could give you whiplash. It was 1430, and Joan found herself in a town called Campigny, doing what she did best, rallying troops and defying the odds. But if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that even the fiercest warriors can face a bad day. On May 23, 1430, Joan was captured by the Burgundians, allies of those pesky English. It was less of a daring battle and more of a classic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, let's talk about these Burgundians. They weren't just sipping wine and making cheese, they were a formidable force with their own ambitions. Capturing Joan was like hitting a jackpot in the medieval power lottery. Forget honor. This was about economics and politics. The Burgundians saw Joan as a valuable bargaining chip, and they were ready to cash in. The going rate for a captured celebrity like Joan, a cool 10,000 livres. That's roughly $3 million in today's terms, enough to buy a castle or two, or at least host a couple of medieval feasts with all the trimmings. Joan's capture wasn't exactly a covert operation. It was more like a public auction, with the English eventually winning the bid. And why wouldn't they? Joan was the face of French resistance, the thorn in their side, and they wanted her gone. The English didn't just see Joan as a military threat, she was a PR nightmare. Her victories were like a bad hair day that just wouldn't end, and they were desperate to silence her. But oh, the irony. The English, who had been outsmarted by a teenager, were now holding her prisoner. They needed a way to legitimize this whole affair, so what did they do? They put her on trial, of course. But not just any trial, a trial for heresy. In the medieval world, heresy was the go-to accusation when you wanted to make someone disappear without getting your hands too dirty. It was like accusing someone of witchcraft, with just as much evidence and twice the drama. The trial was held in Rouen, a city under English control, and it was about as fair as a rigged carnival game. The charges against Joan were as absurd as they were numerous. Her accusers drummed up everything from cross-dressing to witchcraft, essentially accusing her of being too awesome for her own good. The English couldn't beat her on the battlefield, so they dragged her through the mud in the courtroom. The political machinations behind the trial were as thick as the fog on a London morning. The trial wasn't just about Joan. It was about discrediting Charles VII, the so-called King of Burges, and undermining the divine legitimacy of his reign. If Joan was proven to be a heretic, then Charles's coronation, remember, the one Joan made possible, could be painted as a sham. Joan's defense, or lack thereof, was a spectacle of medieval justice at its most inept. Picture a courtroom where the rules were made up as they went along, and the judges were as impartial as a cat in a fish market. Joan faced a panel of 42 judges. Yes, 42, each more eager than the last to see her fall. Her defense team was, well, non-existent. She was left to fend for herself, armed with nothing but her wits and her unwavering faith. And yet, despite the odds stacked against her, Joan's testimony during the trial was nothing short of legendary. Her responses were sharp and full of conviction, leaving her accusers grasping at straws. When questioned about her divine guidance, she famously said, "I was born for this." Talk about a mic drop moment. It's no wonder her words still echo through the annals of history, but let's not sugarcoat it. The trial was a farce. The charges were a hot mess of hypocrisy and fear, designed to make an example of Joan and send a message to anyone else foolish enough to challenge the status quo. Her cross-dressing was one of the main charges, a wardrobe choice rooted in practicality and protection, not rebellion. But in a world where fashion could be a felony, this was scandalous enough to seal her fate. In the end, despite her eloquence and courage, the outcome was never really in doubt. On May 30, 1431, Joan was burned at the stake in Rouen, a martyr to her cause and a symbol of defiance to her last breath. The execution was a grim spectacle, attended by a crowd that knew they were witnessing the end of a legend. But Joan's death was just the beginning of her story's immortal chapter. The trial and execution of Joan of Arc were less about justice and more about power and politics. It was a medieval power play dressed up in religious garb, a reminder of how fear and ambition can twist the wheels of justice. Joan's story continues to captivate because it speaks to the timeless struggle between belief and authority, between a single voice and the cacophony of power. As we move forward in her tale, remember that Joan's life, though short, was a testament to the power of conviction and the enduring impact of a single, determined individual. Her story didn't end in the flames of Rouen. It sparked a fire that would burn brightly in the hearts of many for generations to come. And while her trial was a travesty of justice, it serves as a poignant reminder of the lengths to which those in power will go to silence those who dare to challenge them. So, just when you thought Joan's story couldn't get more complex, let's delve into the ultimate plot twist, her execution. We're talking May 30, 1431, in Rouen, her last stand, and the grand finale of a show that had already been running on borrowed time. It's where chivalric ideals hit a wall of cold, hard pragmatism. You see, medieval martyrdom wasn't the romanticized bravado we read about in epic poems. It was raw, visceral, and incredibly public. Think of it as the ultimate medieval reality show, where the stakes were life and death, and the audience was armed with pitchforks instead of remote controls. Joan's execution was a chilling spectacle, a theatrical display designed to send a clear message. Step out of line, and this could be you. The English and their allies orchestrated the event with the meticulousness of a stage manager at the Globe Theatre. It was less about justice and more about making an example out of Joan. The stage was set in the old marketplace of Rouen, a bustling spot that could easily accommodate a crowd eager for morbid entertainment. Now, if you think our modern-day media circus is intense, imagine a world where public executions were the equivalent of prime-time TV. The authorities wanted a full house, and they got it. As the flames roared, so did the crowd, a mix of awe, fear, and perhaps a touch of regret. After all, Joan, the erstwhile saviour of France, was not just another victim of medieval politics. She was a living legend being snuffed out in real time. Yet, here lies the irony. The chivalric code, which was supposed to uphold ideals like honour, bravery, and fair play, had been twisted into a weapon against Joan. The same knights who were expected to protect the innocent were complicit in her demise. Joan's cross-dressing, wearing men's clothes for practicality, mind you, was cited as heresy, a convenient excuse to mask the political motivations behind her execution. It was all about power, influence, and maintaining the status quo, not some grand medieval morality play. And let's not sugarcoat the aftermath. Joan's ashes were unceremoniously scattered in the Seine, a move designed to erase her from collective memory. But if history has taught us anything, it's that attempting to erase a legend only serves to etch them deeper into the annals of time. Joan's death may have been intended to silence her, but instead it amplified her voice across the centuries. Now here's the kicker. Less than 25 years later, as if history had developed a case of buyer's remorse, Joan was posthumously retried. The tables had turned like a medieval game of musical chairs. By 1456, the winds of political convenience had shifted. Charles VII, the very king Joan had helped crown, was firmly on the throne and looking to polish his legacy. A retrial was ordered, and wait for it, Joan was declared a martyr. Talk about a historical 180. This rehabilitation was no mere gesture of goodwill. It was a calculated move to solidify French nationalism and bolster the legitimacy of Charles's reign. The same church that had condemned her was now singing her praises, proving that even in the 15th century, reputations could be as fickle as the tides. Fast forward to the 19th century, and Joan was well on her way to sainthood. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her, wrapping her story in a halo of sanctity that often glosses over the gritty realities of her life and death. But let's not get too carried away on this romanticized train. Remember, Joan's journey was less about divine visions and more about the stark realities of a nation at war. Her sainthood was the culmination of a centuries-long PR campaign, fueled by a mix of religious fervor and national pride. It's no small wonder that Joan's legacy has endured. She became the poster child for French nationalism, a symbol of resistance and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It's the kind of story that has all the makings of a Hollywood epic, except it's all too real, with a complexity that defies simple moral lessons. In the grand tapestry of history, Joan of Arc stands as a testament to the power of belief and the unpredictability of human nature. Her life was a whirlwind of contradictions. A peasant who dined with kings, a soldier who never wielded a sword, a heretic who became a saint. And while her story is often wrapped in the comforting cloak of legend, it's the raw, unfiltered reality of her experiences that gives it such enduring power. As we move forward in her tale, remember that Joan's narrative is not just about a single, extraordinary individual. It's a reflection of the human struggle against the forces that seek to limit and define us. Joan's life was cut short, yet her spirit continues to inspire and challenge us to this day. The flames that consumed her body ignited a legacy that would burn brightly in the hearts of many for generations to come. Stay tuned as we dive into the final act of Joan's story, exploring how her legacy was molded, mythologized, and manipulated through the ages. Her journey didn't end in the marketplace at Rouen. It was merely the beginning of a saga that would transcend the bounds of time and space, echoing through the corridors of history as a haunting reminder of the enduring power of conviction. And so, Joan's story of grit and glory didn't just peter out with her tragic end. It kept on rolling like a medieval snowball, gathering complexity and controversy across the ages. Let's break down how this peasant girl from Domremy went from heresy to holiness, transforming from a humble shepherdess into a national symbol that even a 20th century bureaucratic machine couldn't resist canonizing. First off, let's talk about the French. They have a knack for turning their historical figures into icons, and Joan was no exception. Posthumously exonerated in 1456, she became a symbol of national unity in a fractured France. Fast forward a few centuries to 1920, and voila, Joan was canonized by Pope Benedict XV. Talk about a transformation, from condemned witch to bona fide saint in fewer than 500 years. That's a faster image rehab than most modern-day celebrities could dream of. Now, why canonization in 1920, you ask? Well, the timing wasn't just coincidental. It was a calculated move in the wake of World War I. France needed a morale boost, and who better to inspire the war-weary nation than a homegrown heroine who'd kicked some serious English butt? It was like they reached back into the dusty annals of history and pulled out Joan as a spiritual rallying cry. A reminder that, against all odds, France could rise from the ashes. But here's the kicker. This was more about politics than piety. The Catholic Church, with its own vested interests, saw in Joan an opportunity to reinforce its authority and relevance in a rapidly modernizing world. After all, nothing says we're still relevant like resurrecting a medieval martyr as a modern saint. Joan's story was repackaged, polished, and presented anew, a mix of divine favor and patriotic fervor that appealed to both churchgoers and nationalists alike. It was a narrative too potent to resist, a blend of faith and nationalism wrapped in a single, saintly figure. However, let's not get swept away by the romanticism without a healthy dose of reality. The story of Joan of Arc has been romanticized to the point where it sometimes resembles a fever dream of medieval PR. For starters, the image of Joan as a lone warrior wielding a sword on the battlefield is more myth than fact. She was a strategist, a morale booster, and a symbol, but she wasn't leading charges with a blade in hand like some knightly action hero. The real battles were fought by seasoned soldiers who knew how to swing a sword without losing an arm. And then there's the matter of Joan's voices, the divine guidance that supposedly steered her through the treacherous waters of French politics and English sieges. In an age where hearing voices could get you a one-way trip to the stake, Joan's claims were both a blessing and a burden. They gave her the confidence to challenge authority, but also painted a target on her back. Her voices were as much a political tool as they were a personal conviction, utilized by the powers that be to justify her actions, and later, to condemn them. Joan's story is a masterclass in the power of narrative. It's a tale that has been shaped, reshaped, and polished to fit the needs of those wielding the pen. From a peasant girl with a divine calling to a national icon, Joan's legacy has been molded by centuries of storytellers with their own agendas. Her sainthood was as much a product of political necessity as it was of faith, a reminder that history is often written not just by the victors, but by those with the loudest voices. But why does Joan's story still resonate today? Why, in an era of smartphones and space travel, do we still find ourselves captivated by a medieval maiden in armor? Perhaps it's because her tale is one of defiance and determination, a reminder that even the humblest beginnings can lead to extraordinary ends. Joan's life was a testament to the power of belief in the face of overwhelming odds, a story that continues to inspire those who dare to dream beyond their circumstances. And let's face it, there's something inherently appealing about an underdog story, especially one that defies the conventions of its time. Joan's tale is a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary figures come from the most ordinary places. Her legacy challenges us to question authority, to stand up for our beliefs, and to never underestimate the power of a single voice in a world that often values conformity over conviction. In the end, Joan of Arc's story is a complex tapestry of myth and reality, faith and politics, courage and sacrifice. It's a narrative that has been embellished over centuries, yet at its core, it remains a compelling testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Whether seen as a saint, a soldier, or a symbol, Joan's legacy is a haunting reminder of the impact one individual can have on the course of history, a legacy that continues to echo through the ages, challenging us to reflect on our own lives and the stories we choose to tell. The rooster's crow isn't just nature's alarm clock, it's your cue to spring into action. You've got a medieval inn to run, and believe me, it's more like managing a bustling airport than a cozy bed and breakfast. Welcome to the 12th century, where the economy of towns often hinges on places like yours, a haven for weary travelers and a hub of commerce. First things first, you feel the heft of your coin purse. The jingle-jangle of coins is the medieval equivalent of your morning coffee, motivating and slightly nerve-wracking. In an age where a single penny could buy a loaf of bread, every coin counts. Inns like yours aren't just pit stops. They're the lifeblood of the travel network, strategically dotted along the dusty roads connecting kingdoms and markets. You shuffle your way to the storeroom as dawn breaks. This isn't just about feeding a few guests, it's about logistics. Ever wonder how much ale an inn goes through in a day? Enough to make Dionysus blush. You've got barrels upon barrels because in medieval times, ale is safer to drink than water. It's the universal solvent for a day's woes, whether you're a knight or a merchant. And speaking of bread, you need to make sure you've got enough of it. A penny loaf might not sound like much, but when you're buying in bulk, it starts to add up. Bread is the backbone of any meal, and keeping it flowing is as critical as keeping a modern airport's runways clear. Miss a delivery, and you've got a riot on your hands, or at least a lot of grumbling stomachs. This isn't just about keeping guests fed, though. It's about keeping them happy enough to leave glowing reviews, word-of-mouth style. You see, medieval inns were the original TripAdvisor. A satisfied customer spreads the word faster than a bard with a new tune. It's not just about food and shelter, it's about reputation. As you check inventory and haggle with local suppliers, you're reminded of the political web that's as tangled as a catapult's ropes. The economy of your village is a microcosm of the kingdom's health. Grain prices fluctuate with every skirmish and treaty, and your inn is smack dab in the middle of it all. You're not just an innkeeper, you're an economic barometer. The social dynamics at play are as complex as a monk's illuminated manuscript. You welcome a tapestry of travelers, pilgrims, merchants, knights, and maybe even a troubadour looking to trade songs for supper. Each brings their own stories, their own gossip, and their own expectations of what an inn should be. It's a melting pot, a medieval microcosm, where class and commerce collide over tankards of ale. You've got to keep your ear to the ground, catching tidbits of news and rumours. A well-informed innkeeper is a well-prepared innkeeper. It's not just about knowing what the king is up to, but who's likely to pass through your doors next. And let's face it, every extra guest is another few coins in the coffer. As the sun climbs higher, you're deep into the rhythm of the morning. Supplies are sorted, the hearth is roaring, and you're ready for the breakfast rush. It's not just porridge. It's a medieval art form. You're crafting meals that fuel journeys, and each bowl is a testament to your skill, or lack thereof. Inns are the crossroads of medieval life, and you're the master of ceremonies. With each guest that walks through the door, you're playing a part in their story, and they in yours. So, as you wipe the sweat from your brow and prepare for the day's challenges, remember, it's not just about surviving. It's about thriving in the chaotic, interconnected web of medieval life. So, as the morning unfolds with the sun climbing higher in the sky, you're not just running an inn. You're orchestrating a medieval symphony of commerce, gossip, and survival. Let's switch gears and dive into the vibrant role your establishment plays as the village's beating heart. In the grand tapestry of medieval life, your inn is less of a backdrop and more of a main stage. First off, forget the quaint notion of inns as just places for a good night's sleep. They were the social media platforms of the 12th century, uniting people long before digital likes and shares. Think of your inn as a medieval Facebook, minus the cat videos, but with plenty of real-life drama. Inns like yours acted as makeshift post offices, delivering messages across the lands. Imagine being the medieval version of a mail carrier, but with more ale and fewer disgruntled customers complaining about late packages. As the local news hub, your inn was buzzing with updates. News travelled faster than a night late for a tournament. Whether it was about the latest skirmish or the mysterious new tax imposed by the king, it reached your ears first. You, the innkeeper, were the ancient equivalent of a news anchor, minus the fancy suit and scripted teleprompter. Your guests, with their tales and tidbits, transformed your common room into a medieval newsroom. And let's be honest, nothing spices up a day like a juicy rumour served alongside a mug of ale. But it wasn't just about hearsay. Hosting the wrong traveller could be as risky as serving spoiled meat. Political dynamics in medieval times were as unpredictable as the weather, and your inn was at the crossroads of it all. Hosting a traveller on the outs with the local lord could turn your cosy inn into a target faster than you could say feudalism. The line between business and survival was razor-thin, and every guest was a potential ally or a disaster waiting to happen. Now, let's talk economics. Your inn was a microcosm of the local economy, a miniature stock market where fortunes were made and lost over a game of dice or a bet on the latest jousting match. The price of ale, the availability of bread, and the cost of lodging fluctuated with the political tides. A war here, a treaty there, and suddenly you're adjusting prices faster than a modern-day stockbroker. You had to be as savvy as a merchant on market day, keeping your wits as sharp as your quills. And speaking of quills, inns also served as the tinder of the times, minus the swiping. Liaisons and alliances were often brokered over a pint, and who knew which acquaintance might prove useful in times of need? The social scene in your inn was as complex as a medieval tapestry, with threads of intrigue and alliances woven into every interaction. Love matches, business deals, and even the odd conspiracy found fertile ground amidst the clinks of cups and the crackling of the hearth. Now, don't let all this romanticize the reality too much. While it sounds thrilling, let's not forget that every transaction, every interaction, was fraught with risk. A single misstep could mean the end of your business, if not your neck. This wasn't the age of Yelp reviews, but of real-world consequences. A disgruntled guest might not just leave a bad review, but could leave you in bad favor with the local nobles, or worse, accuse you of harboring enemies of the crown. Remember, this was a time when hospitality could be a hazardous occupation, and you had to navigate its treacherous waters with the skill of a seasoned sailor. And yet, amidst all this, there was an undeniable allure. The inn was a portal to the wider world, a place where the stories of the realm converged. It was a front-row seat to the drama of medieval life, where every day was unpredictable and every guest a new chapter. So as you keep the ale flowing and the story spinning, remember that your inn is more than just a stopover. It's a microcosm of medieval life, a hub of humanity in all its chaotic, interconnected glory. And as the day wears on, you're not just surviving, you're thriving in a world where the stakes are as high as the tales are tall. Stay tuned, because the adventure is just getting started. As midday rolls in, your inn transforms into a medieval Grand Central Station, minus the timetables and overpriced coffee. Travelers flood through the doors, each coated in a layer of road, dust thick enough to sketch a map of their journey. They're a mixed bag of humanity, from merchants who smell like opportunity, and maybe a bit of horse, to pilgrims with more faith than coin. Each of them is looking for something, be it a meal, a bed, or a tale to take back home like a souvenir. Medieval travel, you see, was less a romantic jaunt and more of a relentless endurance test. Forget your dreams of knights galloping on pristine paths under the moonlight. The roads were more like muddy trails that doubled as obstacle courses. They were often little more than dirt paths, riddled with potholes, and if you were lucky, the odd bandit. Roman roads still crisscrossed the continent, but centuries of neglect had turned these engineering marvels into patchwork quilts of cobblestone and chaos. And yet, despite these challenges, travel was a necessity. Trade routes were the veins of medieval society, pumping goods and gossip from town to town. Your inn, perched alongside one of these vital arteries, is a beacon for weary travelers. A night's stay costs about 4 pence, a small fortune for some, a mere trifle for others. For context, 4 pence could also buy you a sheep, assuming you didn't mind fleecing it yourself. As an innkeeper, your role is akin to that of a diplomat, balancing the needs of the affluent and the frugal. Wealthy merchants, with their finely spun wool and exotic spices, demand attention and a bit of pampering. They're the power players, the ones who can make or break your business with a flick of their coin-laden fingers. On the other hand, you have the pilgrims, whose pockets may be light but whose stories are rich. They come armed with prayers and promises, hoping their spiritual journey is more rewarding than their financial one. Keeping the peace in the common room is an art form. It's not just about serving ale and bread. It's about orchestrating a delicate dance of egos and expectations. A misplaced word or a spilled drink could ignite tensions that burn brighter than your hearth's fire. You're the maestro here, conducting a symphony of small talk and silent negotiations. And let's address the myth of the romantic medieval journey while we're at it. Sure, the idea of wandering through lush meadows and quaint villages sounds idyllic. But the reality, more like trudging through muck and worrying if your travel companion might be eyeing your purse a little too keenly. The roads were fraught with danger, from natural hazards to human ones. Bandits were a constant threat, eager to relieve travelers of their burdens, both literal and financial. But for many, the lure of the road was irresistible, offering a chance to see the world beyond their village and perhaps find their fortune or misfortune. The risks were real, yet the call of the unknown was louder. Every traveler came with their own reasons, their own dreams, and their own stories, turning your inn into a crossroads of life's diverse narratives. As the sun casts long shadows across the common room, you find yourself at the heart of this medieval microcosm. You're not just serving food and drink, you're serving a slice of life, a piece of the world's ever-turning wheel. Each guest is a page in a larger story, and you're the keeper of this ever-evolving narrative. So, as you navigate the hustle and bustle of midday, remember, you're not just an innkeeper. You're a curator of the human experience, one pint at a time. And while you're busy managing this chaos, don't forget to keep an eye on the economic winds. The price of goods fluctuates as wildly as a minstrel's melody. A bad harvest or a skirmish on the border can turn your profit margins to dust faster than a hungry knight can down a loaf of bread. You're not just serving ale. You're serving insight, gleaning information from every whispered conversation and hushed negotiation. The stakes are high, but so is the thrill. This is the medieval world in all its gritty, glorious detail. It's a place where every decision counts, where every interaction is a potential turning point. As the day stretches on, you're reminded that while the roads may be rough and the journeys perilous, the rewards are just as real. You're part of something larger than yourself, a network of connections that binds the medieval world together, one dusty traveler at a time. So, as you watch the sun dip lower in the sky, casting a warm glow across the room, you're already thinking ahead to what's next. The evening promises more arrivals, more stories, and more challenges. But for now, amidst the clatter of mugs and the murmur of voices, you take a moment to appreciate your role in this vibrant tapestry. It's not just about making it through the day. It's about making your mark in a world as unpredictable as it is fascinating. Stay tuned, because the adventure is far from over. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting a warm glow over your bustling inn, you're not just winding down. You're gearing up for the evening rush. The day's hustle is far from over, and the night brings its own set of challenges and opportunities. The economic engine of your establishment continues to rumble, fueled by ale, gossip, and the clink of coins. Running a medieval inn isn't just about keeping the ale flowing and the beds warm. It's an intricate dance with the local authorities and clergy, who are just as interested in your business as your guests are. Taxes and tithes loom large in your ledger, threatening to turn a profitable day into a ledger of losses. In this medieval world, you're not just an innkeeper. You're a finely tuned diplomat, navigating the murky waters of local politics and ecclesiastical expectations. Let's talk numbers, shall we? Taxes could gobble up to 40% of your earnings, depending on the whims of the local lord. And then there's the church, with its hand outstretched for tithes. A solid 10% of your income, thank you very much. It's like running a modern business with a couple of silent partners who don't contribute to the workload, but sure want their cut. The church, after all, needs to fund its own operations, like building those awe-inspiring cathedrals that make your humble inn look like a mud hut in comparison. And let's not forget the cost of labor. You might have a handful of staff, perhaps a couple of scullery maids, a stable hand, and a cook. Their wages are modest, but in a world where the average labourer earns about 2 pence a day, every penny counts. Keep them happy, and they'll keep your inn running smoothly. Neglect them, and you might find yourself short a couple of hands just when you need them most. But it's not all about paying out. You've got to bring in the dough too, and that means staying in the good graces of the local bigwigs. Entertain the local lord with a fine meal or a rare wine, and you might find your taxes mysteriously lowered. Annoy him, and you could be hit with a new levy faster than you can say feudalism. It's a game of medieval chess, and you're playing for keeps. Now, let's dive into the bureaucratic beast that is legal documentation. Your inn doesn't run on charm alone. It's governed by charters and licenses that dictate everything from the number of beds you can offer to the quality of your ale. Each document is a testament to the tangled web of medieval regulation, crafted in language as thick as your morning porridge. One misstep, a missing stamp, a forgotten signature, and you could find your inn closed faster than the tap on a keg. These charters aren't just paper, they're power. Holding the right documents can mean the difference between thriving and merely surviving. They're your shield against the whims of local authorities, and a testament to your legitimacy in a world where legitimacy can be as fleeting as a summer rain. And speaking of rain, Let's not forget the weather's role in your financial equation. A bad storm can keep travelers at bay, turning your bustling inn into a ghost town overnight. The relationship with local clergy is a delicate dance. Hosting a clergy member could mean a blessing for your establishment, both in divine favor and in reputation. But cross them, and you might find your inn cursed with empty tables and silent halls. Remember, in the medieval world, reputation is a currency as tangible as the coins in your purse. As the evening wears on, the common room fills with the hum of conversation, the clatter of mugs, and the occasional burst of laughter. Each sound is a reminder of the delicate balance you must maintain to keep your inn thriving. It's not just about serving food and drink. It's about serving the community, keeping the wheels of local commerce turning, and ensuring that your establishment remains a vital hub in the medieval network. This isn't the romanticized version of medieval life often painted in stories. It's gritty, it's tough, and it's as complex as the tapestries that adorn the walls of noble halls. Yet despite the challenges, there's something undeniably compelling about it all. You're not just part of history, you're shaping it, one meal, one drink, and one conversation at a time. So, as you navigate the evening's rush, balancing trays and tabulations, remember that you're not just an innkeeper. You're a linchpin in the grand tapestry of medieval life, weaving together the threads of commerce, community, and survival. And in this world where every day is a new chapter, you're writing your own story, one that's as rich and varied as the guests who grace your tables. Stay tuned, because the night is young and the adventure is far from over. As the last of the sun's rays fade, you know the real work of the evening begins. Your inn isn't just a place to rest weary heads. It's the epicenter of medieval life, where the threads of the day's stories weave together into a rich tapestry. This isn't just about keeping the ale flowing and the fire stoked. It's about maintaining your status as the heartbeat of the community. Inns like yours were the original networking hubs, long before LinkedIn made business connections a tap away. The medieval innkeeper was part caterer, part diplomat, and part news anchor, all rolled into one. And you, my friend, are the glue holding it all together. Your establishment is more than a place to crash. It's a multifunctional center where alliances are formed, news is exchanged, and fortunes can change hands faster than you can say, ye oldie stock market. You see, medieval inns were critical nodes in the network of commerce and communication that stretched across Europe. They were the medieval version of a bustling city center, a place where the social and economic gears meshed. Your inn was not just a resting place, but a powerhouse of trade and information. It was here that merchants could exchange goods, pilgrims could gather intel, and even the odd spy might pick up some juicy tidbits. Now, let's bust a myth or two. The romanticized notion of the medieval inn as a quaint, peaceful retreat, pure fantasy, picture-less, cozy cottage, and more controlled chaos. The reality was gritty and raw, a constant balancing act of managing resources, dodging political pitfalls, and maintaining a delicate social harmony, all while ensuring that the ale kept flowing and the bread stayed warm. And speaking of bread, did you know that your average medieval innkeeper had to deal with a dizzying array of economic pressures? You were not just a host, but an economist, predicting fluctuations in grain prices and adjusting your inventories accordingly. One bad harvest could send prices soaring, leaving you scrambling to source enough flour to keep your patrons fed. It was less about crafting artisanal loaves and more about survival. In this landscape, your role was pivotal. You were the linchpin of the community, providing not just food and shelter, but news, commerce, and even the occasional political intrigue. Your inn was a microcosm of the larger world, a place where the challenges and triumphs of medieval life played out in miniature. It was here that travelers from all walks of life converged, bringing with them stories and experiences from far-off lands. And let's not forget the legacy of these medieval inns. They laid the groundwork for the modern hospitality industry, shaping how we think about travel and accommodation today. The very concept of a hotel as a place of rest and community owes much to its medieval predecessors. The inns of the past were the first to offer not just a bed, but a sense of belonging, a connection to a broader world. But let's not get too misty-eyed about it all. The life of an innkeeper was no fairy tale. It required resilience, ingenuity, and a fair bit of grit. You had to be as shrewd as a fox and as tough as the leather boots that trudged through your doors. Romantic notions aside, the reality was often harsh, with long hours and little room for error. Yet, despite the challenges, there was an undeniable allure to the role. You were at the center of it all, a curator of the human experience, shaping the stories that unfolded under your roof. In a world where the stakes were high, and the rewards even higher, you thrived on the unpredictability, the constant ebb and flow of life within your walls. So, as the evening wears on and the common room fills with the sound of laughter and clinking mugs, take a moment to appreciate your place in history. You're not just an innkeeper, you're a critical link in the chain of medieval life. You're a custodian of stories, a purveyor of hospitality, and a vital part of the community's fabric. As you watch the flames dance in the hearth and listen to the murmur of conversation, remember that your legacy endures. You are part of a tradition that stretches back centuries, a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of those who came before you. In the grand tapestry of history, your inn is a thread that binds the past to the present, weaving a story that will continue to unfold for generations to come. In the end, the life of a medieval innkeeper was a paradox of simplicity and complexity, of romance and reality. It was a world where every day was a new chapter, every guest a new story. And as the night deepens and the last of the travelers settle into their beds, you stand as a guardian of this rich and varied history, ready to rise with the rooster's crow and do it all over again. In the mid-14th century, Europe was a bustling mix of architectural marvels and questionable hygiene, a place where people were just a sneeze away from medieval chaos. They didn't know it yet, but life was about to get a lot more contagious. The year is 1347, and Europe is about to host the world's least welcome guest, the Black Death. No one sent out invitations, but it showed up anyway, like that one friend who always brings drama to the party. The Black Death originated from Asia, hitching a ride on the Silk Road, a trade route connecting the East and West, bustling with spices, silk, and as it turns out, a few nasty bacteria. Specifically, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague, was ready to rock Europe's world. It made its grand entrance in the port town of Messina, Sicily, in October 1347. Ships docked, sailors disembarked, and death unceremoniously waltzed ashore. The disease spread faster than a medieval gossip rumor, swiftly making its way through trade routes like a determined salesman on a commission. Let's talk about medieval travel for a moment. Picture this. Traders and travelers crisscrossed the continent, their journeys taking months, loaded with goods, but blissfully unaware they were also transporting a deadly microbe. Makes today's travel delays seem like a minor inconvenience, right? From Messina, the plague scurried through Italy, hitched a ride to France, and before anyone could say quarantine, it was wreaking havoc in England and beyond. By early 1348, the disease had spread to Paris and London, and you can bet it didn't stop there. Now, medieval Europe wasn't exactly known for its stellar hygiene practices. Bathing was an annual event, if you were lucky, and bodily odors were masked with heavy perfumes. It's no surprise that the plague found humans to be the perfect hosts. Hygiene was more of a suggestion than a rule, and the idea of germs wasn't even a concept. They believed in miasmas, or bad air, as the culprit for illness. If only they knew the real villains were flea-infested rats, which thrived in the squalor of medieval streets, dining on waste like it was a buffet. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the medieval medical wisdom, or lack thereof. Physicians of the time relied on astrology, bloodletting, and leeches. If that sounds like a nightmare, well, it was. Their best advice was to avoid bad smells, which, given the state of European cities, was akin to telling a fish to avoid water. The concept of bacteria was centuries away, so their solutions were about as effective as a chocolate teapot. The economic impact of the Black Death was as brutal as the disease itself. As the plague swept through, it decimated populations, wiping out an estimated 25 to 30 million people in Europe, about one-third of the population. With so many gone, labourers were scarce, and the survivors found themselves in high demand. This led to a shift in the social structure, as peasants could demand better wages and conditions. The aristocracy, not thrilled about this newfound worker empowerment, tried to impose wage controls, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a paper towel. But let's not romanticize the chaos too much. The reality was grim. Entire families were wiped out, villages were deserted, and mass grave became the norm. The psychological impact was profound, with people grappling with the randomness of death. Religious fervor intensified as people sought answers, and some turned to flagellation, whipping themselves as penance, hoping to appease an angry god. It was a time when desperation met superstition, and logic was often the first casualty. The Black Death's arrival forever altered the course of European history, but at the time it was simply an era of terror and confusion. It's easy to look back with a smirk at the absurdity of their beliefs and practices, but who knows what the future will think of us. For now, we can appreciate the resilience of a continent that, despite the odds, managed to survive the plague's wrath and lay the groundwork for a radically transformed Europe. As Europe limped out of the 14th century, it was clear that things would never be the same. The Black Death had taken its toll, claiming the lives of an estimated 25 to 30 million people by 1351. That's roughly one-third of Europe's population at the time, a grim statistic that's as mind-boggling today as it was back then. Imagine a room full of people and having every third person suddenly vanish. It wasn't just a population drop. It was a seismic shift in the social and economic fabric of the continent. With so many people gone, the workforce was decimated, leaving fields untended and businesses shuttered. Picture medieval Europe as a board game where half the pieces had been swept off the table. Farms were left fallow, crops rotted in the fields, and the once bustling marketplaces looked like ghost towns. If you think the supply chain issues of the 21st century were bad, medieval Europe had them beat by a long shot. Sure, they didn't have Amazon deliveries or smartphones, but they were dealing with the medieval version of sorry, we're out of stock on a massive scale. The economic upheaval that followed was both devastating and, oddly enough, transformative. Suddenly, labor was in high demand, and those who survived found themselves in a rare position of power. Peasants, yes, the very folks who were once at the bottom of the feudal food chain, began to demand better wages and conditions. It was like a real-life game of Monopoly where the underdogs suddenly got to call the shots. The aristocracy, predictably, was not amused. They attempted to impose wage controls, but it was like trying to herd cats. The workers had the upper hand, and they knew it. This shift played a crucial role in the slow dismantling of the feudal system, setting the stage for a more modern economic structure. But let's not get too starry-eyed about this newfound worker empowerment. The reality was still pretty grim. Entire communities were wiped out, and the psychological scars left by the plague were deep. People turned to religion in droves, hoping for some divine explanation or relief. And when that didn't work, they resorted to more desperate measures, like flagellation. Yes, whipping oneself was considered a valid method of penance, as if self-inflicted pain could somehow make sense of the chaos. It's a bit like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle by throwing the pieces out the window. While Europe was grappling with its post-plague identity crisis, a slew of myths about the causes of the Black Death began to circulate, each more colourful than the last. One popular theory was that the plague was spread by poisoned wells, a notion that, while completely unfounded, conveniently found scapegoats in marginalized communities. Another favorite was the miasma theory, which blamed bad air and unpleasant smells for the spread of disease. This gem of an idea led to some truly bizarre remedies, like carrying around bouquets of flowers to ward off the stench and presumably the plague. It's the medieval equivalent of thinking you can cure a cold with a nice potpourri arrangement. And then there were the medical treatments. Oh boy, medieval medicine was a real trip. Physicians of the time had some rather creative, if utterly ineffective, remedies. They suggested eating crushed emeralds or bathing in vinegar as cures. Apparently, if you were wealthy enough to afford such luxuries, you could feel fancy while still dying of the plague. It's hard to believe that anyone thought these methods would work, but in a world without antibiotics or an understanding of germs, desperate times called for desperate measures. These myths, while laughable today, were deadly serious back then. They shaped public perception and policy, sometimes with tragic consequences. The idea of poisoned wells, for example, led to violent persecution of Jewish communities who were baselessly accused of contaminating water supplies. It's a stark reminder of how fear and ignorance can fuel prejudice and violence, a lesson that, sadly, still resonates in our own time. The Black Death was more than just a health crisis. It was a turning point in European history. It forced a re-evaluation of societal norms and economic practices. The labor shortages and shifting power dynamics challenged the rigid structures of feudalism, paving the way for a more fluid and dynamic society. It was a painful and chaotic transition, but one that ultimately laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and the modern age. Yet, for all the change it sparked, the Black Death also highlighted the limits of human understanding and the dangers of superstition. It was a time when science and reason were in short supply, and people clung to myths and old wives' tales as a way to make sense of the incomprehensible. In a way, it was a harsh lesson in humility, a reminder that, despite all our advancements, we're still at the mercy of forces beyond our control. So, while the Black Death was undoubtedly a catastrophe of epic proportions, it was also a catalyst for change. It forced Europe to confront its vulnerabilities and rethink its assumptions. And in the aftermath, a new world began to take shape, one that would eventually give rise to the cultural and scientific achievements we now take for granted. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's still plenty of plague-induced drama to unpack, and more than a few myths left to debunk. So stay tuned as we continue to unravel the tangled web of history, one grim statistic at a time. And speaking of myths left to debunk, the social fabric of Europe was about to get a serious makeover. Imagine the class system as a meticulously stacked Jenga tower, delicately balanced and seemingly untouchable, until the Black Death came along and yanked out a few crucial pieces. Suddenly, the whole structure teetered and swayed, much to the horror of the feudal lords who thought they had a nice, stable game going. Let's dive into the labor market shake-up. With the plague claiming a whopping 25 to 50% of the population in some regions, the workforce suddenly had a lot more leverage. Picture the surviving peasants like a rock band that just hit the big time. Agents, or in this case, lords, were practically falling over themselves to book them. Wages shot up faster than a medieval arrow, and peasants started demanding better working conditions. They were done playing by the old feudal rules, and who could blame them? After all, they just survived one of history's worst pandemics. The aristocracy, predictably, wasn't thrilled about this new peasant empowerment. Feudal lords tried to enforce wage controls through laws like England's Statute of Labourers in 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But trying to regulate wages in a post-plague economy was like trying to hold water in a sieve. Workers simply moved to regions offering better pay, leaving lords scrambling to find someone, anyone, to plough their fields. It was a medieval game of cat and mouse, with the mice suddenly armed with a newfound sense of self-worth. This economic upheaval wasn't just about numbers and laws. It had real, tangible effects on daily life. Take Boccaccio's The Decameron, a vivid tapestry of tales spun by a group of 10 young Florentines who fled to the countryside to escape the plague. Through their stories, Boccaccio paints a picture of a society grappling with upheaval, where old hierarchies are questioned and new norms are established. The tales reflect not only the chaos of the times, but also the human resilience and adaptability in the face of catastrophe. While peasants were busy cashing in on their newfound clout, the church was having its own existential crisis. The clergy, once the moral compass of medieval society, found their credibility sinking faster than a stone in a pond. People had looked to the church for answers and protection during the plague, but when prayers and penance failed to stop the relentless spread of death, disillusionment set in. The clergy's inability to provide salvation or solace led to a decline in their authority, a shift as monumental as a tectonic plate realignment in the spiritual landscape of Europe. And just when the church thought things couldn't get worse, the clergy themselves became prime targets for the plague, with mortality rates among priests reportedly as high as 40%. This left a severe shortage of religious officials, forcing the church to hastily ordain new priests, often without proper training. The result? A clergy that was not only diminished in numbers, but also in competence, further eroding the church's standing. This decline in ecclesiastical credibility paved the way for new religious movements and practices. People began to seek solace outside the traditional church framework, resulting in the rise of mysticism and personal piety. Some turned to flagellant movements, where bands of penitents roamed the countryside whipping themselves in hopes of divine intervention. It was a darkly theatrical display of devotion, part religious fervor, part performance art, as if saying to the heavens, "Look, we're really serious about this repentance thing." Yet it wasn't all gloom and doom. The Black Death inadvertently sparked a cultural and intellectual revival. With the old order disrupted, new ideas began to take root, setting the stage for the Renaissance. Universities benefited from the increased social mobility, as more people sought education to improve their circumstances. This intellectual ferment, combined with the economic shifts, laid the groundwork for a more dynamic and innovative society. Amidst this backdrop of change, the myths continue to swirl. Tales of poisoned wells, rogue planets, and divine wrath fueled the fires of superstition, providing convenient scapegoats for an inexplicable catastrophe. And while these stories might seem quaint or even comical today, they underscore a universal truth about human nature. When faced with chaos, we crave explanations, however far-fetched they might be. The Black Death was a catalyst for transformation, reshaping not just the population, but also the very foundations of European society. It was a time when the old world was swept away, and a new one began to emerge from the ashes. The social and political landscape was forever altered, as the rigid hierarchies of feudalism crumbled and new opportunities arose for those willing to seize them. So, as we wrap up this chapter of our grim yet fascinating tale, let's remember that the story of the Black Death is far from over. It set in motion forces that would continue to reshape the continent for centuries to come. And while we may chuckle at the absurdities and myths of medieval times, let's not forget the resilience and adaptability of those who lived through it. They laid the groundwork for a world that, despite its scars, was poised for rebirth. There's much more to explore as we delve deeper into the aftermath of the Black Death. From the economic ramifications to the cultural shifts, the story is rich with lessons and insights that resonate even today. So, stick around as we continue to unravel the tangled web of history, one thread at a time. As the Black Death swept through Europe like a particularly grim broom, it left more than just a trail of devastation in its wake. It also carved out a niche for a burgeoning genre that we'll call medieval goth. Welcome to the age of macabre art, where skeletons danced on frescoes and skulls were the hottest accessory. This wasn't just medieval mood lighting. It was the birth of memento mori, a stark reminder that life was short, death was inevitable, and you might as well enjoy your ale while you can. The plague, in its indiscriminate cruelty, had a way of making people confront the big existential questions, like, what's the point? And why do I even bother showering once a year? Art of the period reflected this newfound obsession with mortality. Take the dance macabre, a popular motif popping up everywhere from cathedrals to manuscripts. These morbid parades depicted skeletons leading the living, kings, peasants, and everything in between, to the grave. It's like the ultimate party where everyone's on the guest list, whether they like it or not. But why all the gloom and doom? Well, the plague struck at the heart of European society, throwing into sharp relief the fragility of life and the futility of earthly pursuits. Artists, ever the opportunists, seized on this theme, delivering a visual slap in the face to anyone who dared forget their mortality. It was the artistic equivalent of saying, "Hey, don't get too comfy. You're not getting out of here alive." While the artists were busy with their bone-chilling masterpieces, the everyday folks were grappling with their own, more visceral responses to the chaos. Enter the flagellants, the ultimate medieval performance artists. These bands of self-flagellating believers roamed from town to town, whipping themselves into a bloody frenzy in the hopes of staving off divine wrath. It was part religious devotion, part travelling circus, as they sought to demonstrate their penance in the most dramatic fashion possible. This fervour wasn't just about personal piety. It was also a desperate attempt to grasp at control in a world that had spun wildly out of it. Flagellant movements offered a sense of agency, however grim, in a time when the average person felt about as powerful as a flea on a rat. They believed that by publicly punishing themselves, they might persuade God to lift the plague. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. While the flagellants whipped up their own brand of hysteria, another, more sinister movement was gaining traction. Witch hunts. When the going gets tough, the tough, apparently, starts scapegoating. In the throes of the plague, marginalized groups became convenient targets for blame. It was easier for some to believe that the plague was the result of nefarious plots rather than a bacterial hitchhiker. Jews, women, and strangers found themselves accused of witchcraft or poisoning wells, and the hysteria led to persecutions that were as tragic as they were absurd. The notion of a united Europe rallying together in the face of disaster, pure fantasy. Instead, the continent fractured along lines of fear and suspicion. The romanticized idea of solidarity crumbled under the weight of baseless accusations and mass paranoia. It turns out, nothing brings people together quite like a shared enemy, real or imagined. As for the cures that people clung to in their desperation, they ranged from the quaint to the downright bizarre. One popular method was to slaughter a goat and wrap yourself in its still warm skin. If you were feeling particularly adventurous, you might try bathing in urine, or even drinking it. It's the kind of advice that makes you grateful for modern medicine, even with its occasional side effects. Despite the chaos, some sought more intellectual solace. The period saw a surge in mystical writings and philosophical musings on the nature of life and death. Thinkers like Petrarch and Boccaccio began to question the status quo, setting the stage for the Renaissance. It was as if the Black Death had shaken the snow globe of European thought, and the flakes were slowly settling into new patterns. The psychological scars left by the plague were as deep as the physical ones, with trauma manifesting in art, religion, and even politics. The Church, struggling to maintain its grip, found itself competing with a burgeoning market of ideas. People craved answers, and they weren't waiting around for the clergy to provide them. The seeds of humanism were being sown, and the soil, fertilized by the chaos of the plague, was ripe for growth. So, while the Black Death was a period of darkness and despair, it was also a catalyst for change. It forced people to confront their mortality, question their beliefs, and seek new paths in an uncertain world. And in the ashes of what was lost, a new Europe slowly began to take shape, one that would eventually rise to heights of creativity and innovation. But that, dear listeners, is a story for another time. For now, let's leave the dance macabre playing in the background as we prepare to delve deeper into the post-plague evolution of a continent forever changed. As the dance macabre played its eerie tune, Europe found itself tiptoeing into the next act of its historical drama, where the stage was set for an unexpected renaissance, both literally and figuratively. The Black Death, that uninvited guest who wreaked havoc like a rock star trashing a hotel room, had left behind a continent forever altered. Yet, as the dust settled, the seeds of transformation began to sprout, and Europe was on the cusp of an era that would redefine art, science, and society itself. First up on the list of unintended consequences, the decline of feudalism. Picture feudalism as a medieval pyramid scheme, with peasants at the bottom doing all the heavy lifting while the lords at the top reaped the benefits. But the plague, in its relentless efficiency, knocked out a significant chunk of the population, including a fair share of the pyramid builders. With labourers suddenly in short supply, peasants who had survived the grim reaper's visit found themselves in a novel position. They could demand better wages and conditions, who knew that living through a pandemic could be a ticket to upward mobility. The aristocracy, predictably, wasn't keen on this shift in power dynamics. They attempted to cling to the old ways like a toddler clutching a favourite toy. But the times, they were changing. Laws like England's Statute of Labourers in 1351 tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but those laws held about as much water as a sieve. The workers had tasted the sweet nectar of leverage, and they weren't about to give it up. This labour upheaval chipped away at the rigid structures of feudalism, paving the way for a more modern economic system. The serfs were breaking free, and Europe was inching towards capitalism, one disgruntled peasant at a time. With the labour market in flux, the economic landscape was also undergoing a radical makeover. Cities began to swell as people moved in search of new opportunities, leading to the rise of a burgeoning merchant class. This new social group had money, influence, and a penchant for art and culture that would fuel the Renaissance. The merchants weren't just counting coins. They were commissioning works that would adorn cathedrals and palaces, leaving a legacy of beauty born from the ashes of despair. Speaking of beauty, the Renaissance was more than just a revival of classical art and thought. It was a full-blown cultural revolution. The Black Death had forced people to question everything, from the nature of the universe to the role of humanity within it. Thinkers like Petrarch and Boccaccio, who had grappled with the chaos of the plague years, laid the intellectual groundwork for this new era. Their writings encouraged a shift from the divine to the human, sparking a movement that placed man at the center of the universe. It was the beginning of humanism, a philosophy that would challenge the very foundations of medieval society. This philosophical shift wasn't just academic navel-gazing. It had real-world implications. Artists began to explore new techniques and perspectives, leading to masterpieces that still captivate us today. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. No, not the teenage mutant ninja turtles, but the real Renaissance men, ushered in an era of unprecedented creativity. Their works, inspired by both the beauty and the brutality of life, reflected a world eager to move beyond the shadows of the plague. The Renaissance also brought about scientific and technological advancements that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, revolutionized the spread of ideas. Suddenly, knowledge wasn't just the purview of the elite. It was accessible to anyone who could get their hands on a book. This democratization of information laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution, a period that would radically alter humanity's understanding of the natural world. Yet, for all its advancements, the Renaissance was not a utopia. The plague's psychological scars lingered, influencing the art and literature of the time. Writers like Dante and Chaucer grappled with themes of mortality and morality, their works echoing the existential dread that had gripped Europe. The spectre of death remained a constant companion, a reminder of the fragility of life even amidst the burgeoning optimism of the age. Despite the horrors of the Black Death, its legacy was not solely one of devastation. It inadvertently set the stage for transformations that would shape the modern world. The pandemic had forced Europe to confront its vulnerabilities, question its traditions, and embrace new possibilities. In the process, it had torn down the old order and cleared a path for innovation and discovery. And yet, as we look back on this tumultuous period, it's hard not to marvel at humanity's uncanny ability to find silver linings in the darkest of clouds. The Black Death was a catastrophe of epic proportions, but it also sparked a renaissance that changed the course of history. It's a testament to our resilience and our penchant for questionable decision-making. After all, it took a pandemic to pry open the doors of progress. So, as we wrap up this chapter in our historical journey, let's take a moment to appreciate the paradox of human nature, our capacity for both folly and brilliance, for despair and hope. The story of the Black Death is a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable adversity, we have the power to adapt, innovate, and ultimately to thrive. And while we may chuckle at the absurdities of medieval life, let's not forget that our own era, with its quirks and challenges, will one day be the subject of similar scrutiny. In the grand tapestry of history, each thread tells a story of survival, transformation, and the indomitable spirit of humanity. The sun peeks through your window in ancient Athens, bringing with it the promise of another bustling day. But before visions of democracy and marble columns dance through your head, let's hit pause to focus on a reality often swept under the historical Persian rug: the life of Athenian women. Contrary to what you might think, these women weren't just lounging around all day, perfecting their toga draping. Nope, they were the unsung heroines of the household economy, a crucial cog in the well-oiled machine of Greek society. First on your agenda is managing the household, a job that makes modern multitasking look like a leisurely stroll through the agora. You're overseeing slaves, who, let's be honest, are the real hands-on workforce, but the responsibility for their productivity and the welfare of the household rests squarely on your shoulders. It's like running a small business, except without the spreadsheets and with a lot more wool. Speaking of wool, textile production is your next big gig. Athens didn't become a hub of commerce and culture by ignoring the fine art of weaving. Your day might start with the soft, repetitive clatter of the loom, a sound that would make even the most dedicated ASMR artist jealous. Forget the romantic notion of leisurely crafting a single garment. You're churning out textiles faster than a modern-day fashion sweatshop, because every family needs clothing, and that market doesn't slow down for anyone. The myth of the idle Athenian woman is one of those charming little historical fibs that feels nice, but crumbles under scrutiny. Women were the economic backbone of the household, and in some cases, they even owned property. But don't get too excited about that last part. It's usually in the absence of a male heir or some other loophole that would make a tax lawyer's head spin. Still, it's a far cry from the caricature of women as mere domestic dacre. Now, you're not just producing textiles for your family. There's a thriving market for these goods. The currency might be drachmas, but the real measure of wealth here is productivity. Your weaving skills aren't just keeping your family clothed, they're enabling trade. Texts like Xenophon's Oeconomicus highlight women's roles in this domestic economy, but they do it with such subtlety you'd think they were trying to keep it a secret. After all, it's not just about keeping the oikos, household, running smoothly. It's about contributing to the polis, city-state itself. By the time noon rolls around, you're knee-deep in chores that would make a 19th-century homesteader break a sweat. You're not just running the household. You're managing it like a Fortune 500 company, minus the boardroom drama and with a lot more goats. And this is where the economic backbone analogy really hits home. While men are out philosophizing or politicking, you're ensuring the household is both productive and profitable. It's a role that's historically undervalued but absolutely essential. And let's not forget the educational responsibilities. Sure, girls aren't getting the same formal education as boys, but that doesn't mean you're not teaching the next generation the skills they need to perpetuate this cycle. Through hands-on experience, young girls learn the art of managing a household, ensuring that the economic wisdom of the ages is passed down, even if it's not enshrined in the annals of history. But the day's not over yet. As the afternoon light starts to wane, you might find a moment to engage in some social activities. Perhaps a visit with other women in the neighborhood to exchange textile tips or discuss the latest household management strategies. It's an informal network of knowledge sharing that predates social media by a few millennia. And despite the lack of hashtags, it plays a critical role in the social fabric of Athens. As evening approaches, you prepare the family meal, a task that doubles as a nightly ritual of bonding and sustenance. It's a moment to reflect on the day's work and perhaps share a few wry observations about the state of the city. After all, politics might be a man's world, but women have a unique perspective, shaped by their direct involvement in the economic and social foundations of the household. So, as the sun sets over the Acropolis, and you finally find a moment to rest, remember, while the spotlight of history may often overlook the contributions of women in ancient Athens, their impact is woven into the very fabric of society, quite literally. And as you drift off to sleep, you can do so with the knowledge that tomorrow brings another day of shaping the world, one thread at a time. As you drift off to sleep, the Athenian sun sets on the Acropolis, but its beams will be back to illuminate another day filled with societal puzzles. And speaking of puzzles, let's untangle the social fabric that defined your life as an Athenian woman. If you thought your contributions to the household were where the story ended, think again. There's a whole political and social landscape to navigate, and it's as jagged as a Spartan spear. Now, while you're busy weaving your way through domestic life, let's step outside and peek into the broader societal weave. In Athens, the social structure is as rigid as a Doric column. Despite your role as the household's backbone, venturing beyond the domestic sphere is like trying to sneak into the Parthenon with muddy sandals. You're legally bound and socially shackled, thanks to a blend of laws and philosophical musings that make your world feel a bit like a gilded cage. Enter the Athenian laws, which are about as welcoming to women as a Spartan at an Athenian symposium. Solon, the revered Athenian lawgiver, was exactly your feminist ally. His reforms, while crucial for democracy, didn't extend the olive branch of freedom to women. They were more like the olive oil in the salad, important but always in the background. Women couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, and couldn't even own property outright unless they were heiresses or widows. And even then, their autonomy was conditional, like a lease with an asterisk. Then we've got the philosophical heavyweights like Aristotle, who had opinions on women that were less than flattering. In his Politics, he likens the role of women to that of slaves and minors, suggesting that women possess a natural defectiveness. Ouch! Thanks, Aristotle. It's a wonder you didn't get a side-eye from every Athenian woman who heard about that one. His teachings reinforced the idea that women were inferior and needed male guardianship, which conveniently kept them out of the public spotlight. But let's hop on over to Sparta for a minute. You might think Sparta, with its warrior ethos, would be even harsher on women. Right. Wrong. Spartan women had liberties that would make their Athenian sisters' heads spin. Unlike in Athens, where women were expected to keep a low profile, Spartan women were out and about, managing estates while their men were off perfecting their spear-throwing techniques. They were educated, could own property, and were even encouraged to exercise, an idea that would make an Athenian philosopher drop his scroll in shock. Why this stark contrast? Well, Sparta needed its women to be strong, both physically and mentally. They believed that strong women would produce strong warriors. It's a bit like ancient eugenics with a side of gym membership. They even had a saying: Spartan women give birth to real men. Talk about setting expectations high. This freedom, however, wasn't purely progressive. It was utilitarian, driven by the state's perpetual war footing. Still, let's not romanticize Spartan society too much. While the image of the liberated Spartan woman is appealing, it comes with strings attached, and not the kind you might weave into a tapestry. Spartan women weren't warriors themselves. They were crucial to the warrior culture, but always in supportive roles. The real battlefield was reserved for the men, who were off fighting, while women managed the home front. Back in Athens, though, such freedoms were the stuff of legends. Here, the domestic space was your domain, but stepping beyond those boundaries was like venturing into a minefield. The agora, the bustling heart of public life, was mostly a male playground. Sure, you might visit occasionally, but always under the watchful eye of a male guardian. Athenian society was structured to keep women's influence within the home, a place deemed safe from the corrupting influence of politics. Yet, within these constraints, women found ways to wield power. It wasn't the overt kind that men exercised, but a subtler, behind-the-scenes influence. A well-managed household contributed to the family's status, and a woman's ability to maneuver within her social circle could tip the balance in her family's favor. Networking over textiles, anyone. Consider Aspasia, the consort of Pericles, the great Athenian statesman. She was a foreigner, yet wielded considerable influence in Athenian politics through her relationship with Pericles. Her intellectual salon attracted the city's brightest minds, and she even got a shout-out from Plato. Not bad for someone supposedly relegated to the shadows. Her life is a testament to the power women could exert, even in a society that preferred them silent. So, as you navigate this intricate web of societal norms, remember that while Athenian women lacked the freedoms of their Spartan counterparts, their influence was like the threads in their looms, subtle yet integral to the fabric of the city. And tomorrow, well, it's another day in the life of a woman in ancient Greece, where the challenges are as numerous as the stars over the Acropolis, and the stakes as high as its marble columns. As noon casts its golden glow over Athens, we take a detour from the domestic marathon to dive into the cerebral and sacred realms women navigated. Though Athenian women were often excluded from formal education, they weren't just sitting around doodling on papyrus. They were key players in the spiritual life of the city, wielding influence that would make even the most stoic philosopher arch an eyebrow. Let's start with education, or the tantalizing lack thereof. While boys enjoyed the privilege of formal schooling, learning everything from Homeric epics to the finer points of geometry and rhetoric, girls were generally sidelined. Not that this meant a life of ignorance. No, siree. Education happened in the home, through the ancient art of osmosis. Mothers taught daughters the skills needed to run a household, which doubled as a crash course in ancient economics. It's like learning algebra through baking, practical and delicious. Now, before you get all misty-eyed imagining these home lessons as some idyllic, Pinterest-worthy experience, let's add a dose of reality. The education women received was as much about survival and social standing as it was about knowledge for knowledge's sake. Remember, this was an era where a woman's reputation could make or break a family's fortunes faster than you could say, Euripides. But while formal schooling was off the table, religion offered a different kind of classroom. Enter the priestess. In a society where women were often seen and not heard, the role of priestess was a rare exception. These women led rituals, oversaw temple activities, and played a crucial role in maintaining the sacred balance between the divine and the mortal. It was like being a CEO of spirituality, minus the stock options and quarterly reports. Consider the Pythia, the high priestess of the temple of Apollo at Delphi. She was one of the most powerful figures in the ancient world, doling out prophecies that shaped the fates of city-states and kings. Her words were gospel, interpreted and recorded by male priests, of course, but her influence was undeniable. Talk about having a hotline to the gods. The duties of a priestess weren't just limited to high-profile gigs like Delphi, though. In Athens, women could serve in various religious roles, from the priestess of Athene Polias, who was responsible for the care of the goddess's statue and sacred objects, to participating in the Panathenaic festival, one of the city's grandest religious celebrations. Here, women carried sacred vessels, led processions, and took part in rituals that were as much about civic duty as divine devotion. This rare avenue offered women a taste of power and societal status that the average loom-bound Athenian could only dream of. Being a priestess was a prestigious gig, often reserved for women from elite families. But it wasn't just about privilege. It was also a strategic move within the city's political chessboard. Having a daughter in a prominent religious role could boost a family's standing, making them the ancient equivalent of social media influencers, minus the selfies. Yet, it's important to note that this influence came with strings attached. Priestesses were expected to be paragons of virtue, their lives scrutinized for any hint of scandal that could taint their sacred duties. It's like being a celebrity without the red carpet, glamorous, but with the ever-present threat of public disgrace looming overhead. While the religious sphere offered a semblance of power, it was still a gilded cage of sorts. Women couldn't use their religious roles to influence politics directly. They were conduits of the divine, not arbiters of civic policy. Still, their ability to sway public opinion through religious ceremonies and festivals was a potent form of soft power. Think of it as the original PR campaign, where the stakes were as high as the Acropolis itself. So, as the sun reaches its zenith, and the city hums with the energy of another bustling day, consider the paradoxes of this ancient world. Women in Athens were both marginalized and indispensable, confined yet influential. Their education was informal, their power indirect, but their impact was as enduring as the myths that have come down to us through the ages. And as we pause here, on the cusp of afternoon, remember that the story isn't over. There's more to uncover about how these ancient women navigated their world, one sacred rite and whispered lesson at a time. Stay tuned, because the next chapter promises to be as enlightening as a Delphic oracle's cryptic counsel. As the sun dips gracefully beyond the horizon, let's pivot from divine rites to the earthy realities of marriage and family life in ancient Greece. If you think the Athenian marriage scene was straight out of a romantic epic, think again. It's less Romeo and Juliet and more let's make a deal. Picture this. A typical Athenian girl, barely 14, is getting hitched, not because she's found the love of her life, but because she's become a key piece on her family's socio-economic chessboard. Back then, marriage was less about love and more about survival, economic, political, and social. It's like those reality TV shows where people marry strangers, but without the cameras or the chance to say, I don't. The average age for a girl to marry was just 14 or 15, which today would barely qualify her to drive a chariot, let alone manage a household. The first order of business was the dowry, a kind of financial sweetener to help the marriage go down. This wasn't just pocket change, folks. A dowry could be sizable, often a mix of cash, property, and other goods, designed to ensure the bride's future comfort, and let's be honest, to make her a more attractive prospect. Think of it as the ancient world's version of a prenup, but with more goats involved. And what did the groom get out of all this? Well, aside from the bride, he got his hands on the dowry, which was essentially his to manage, though not outright own. If he decided to call it quits, he had to return it, or at least its equivalent value. This financial entanglement was like a 5th century insurance policy, ensuring that marriage wasn't taken lightly, even if love was conspicuously absent from the contract. Once the deal was sealed, the real work began. The bride moved into her husband's household, ready, or not, to assume the role of the household manager. But let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't about playing house. It was a serious upgrade from her childhood role, with responsibilities that could rival a corporate CEO's, minus the fancy boardroom. Her job was to produce heirs, manage the home, and perpetuate the family line, a task that came with societal pressure so intense, even a Spartan warrior might wince. Inscriptions and real-life accounts from the time reveal that women were expected to bear children, preferably male, to ensure the continuation of the family legacy. This wasn't just about family pride. It was a matter of economic necessity. Sons were the ones who would inherit property and continue the family name, while daughters were seen as temporary members of the household, destined to marry and move into another family's domain. The dynamics within these households were as complex as a Greek drama. Women wielded influence over domestic affairs, but their power was often informal and indirect. It was like playing a game of chess where the pieces were constantly shifting and the rules were never in your favor. Yet, despite these constraints, women found ways to assert themselves, often through clever maneuvering and alliances within the family. Remember, these marriages were often more about alliances than affection. Families used matrimonial ties to strengthen political and economic connections. It was like a game of social Tetris, where each block needed to fit perfectly into the societal structure. Marrying into the right family could elevate one's status, increase wealth, and forge powerful alliances. It's a bit like networking at a mixer, but with more togas and less small talk about the weather. But let's not romanticize the past too much. While the idea of marriage as an alliance might sound pragmatic, the reality was often harsh. Women had little say in the matter, and love was a luxury few could afford. In many cases, the emotional disconnect between husband and wife was as wide as the Aegean Sea. Yet, despite these challenges, marriages often endured, held together by necessity and mutual dependence rather than passion. So, as the afternoon fades into evening, we find ourselves contemplating the intricate web of marriage and family life in ancient Greece. It was a world where love took a backseat to duty, and personal desires were often sacrificed on the altar of social obligation. Yet, within these constraints, women navigated their lives with resilience, finding ways to exert influence and maintain their dignity in a society that valued them as much for their lineage as for their loyalty. And as we close this chapter, remember that the story of women in ancient Greece is far from over. The complexities of their lives, the challenges they faced, and the legacies they left behind are woven into the very fabric of history, waiting to be unraveled in the tales yet to come. Stay tuned, because the next part promises to delve even deeper into the lives of these remarkable women, revealing the truths that lie beneath the myths. As the ancient Greek day dims, and we reach the twilight of our historical journey, let's tackle the myths and realities woven into the legacy of Greek women, like threads in a tapestry that's been both admired and misunderstood. While these women weren't exactly starring in their own epics, their influence reverberates through history like the echoes from the Parthenon's walls. Let's start by addressing the romanticized image of the Greek woman, often portrayed as a damsel draped in a toga, languidly reclining while philosophers debated. In reality, women's lives were more akin to a strategic game of societal chess, where every move counted and the stakes were high. Forget the idyllic imagery. The average Greek woman was more likely to be found managing a bustling household than lounging poetically. Even the notion of the passive Greek woman crumbles under the weight of historical evidence. Consider the archaeological finds that reveal women's active participation in religious festivals, not just as spectators, but as key players. These roles, while religious in nature, doubled as social and political events. The Eleusinian Mysteries, for example, were ceremonies where women held significant roles, wielding influence that rivaled their male counterparts. These events were less about mystic revelations and more about reinforcing social bonds and community cohesion. Then there's the myth of the isolated Greek woman, confined to the domestic sphere, a narrative that ignores the vibrant social networks women maintained. Sure, they weren't debating politics in the agora, but they were certainly influencing the social and economic fabric of their communities through these networks. The gatherings of women, often centered around domestic tasks like textile production, were the ancient equivalent of a think tank, where ideas and strategies circulated like the latest gossip. Let's talk legacy. The roles and limitations of Greek women have been co-opted into modern gender narratives, sometimes with the subtlety of a chariot race. On one hand, they're seen as symbols of patriarchal oppression, while on the other, they're romanticized as paragons of virtue and domestic tranquility. Both views miss the complexity of their lived experiences. These women navigated a world that was as much about survival and status as it was about societal expectations. The legacy of Greek women isn't just about what they endured, but also about what they contributed. Their roles in the household economy, their participation in religious and social life, and their influence within their family structures all paint a picture of resilience and ingenuity. The economic contributions of women, often overlooked in historical narratives, were vital to the functioning of Greek society. They were the silent partners in the grand enterprise of the city-state, ensuring its stability and prosperity. As we sift through the remnants of the past, primary sources like Xenophon's Oikonomicus or Aristophanes' plays give us glimpses of women's roles that are both enlightening and frustratingly incomplete. These texts, often pennied by men, reflect a bias that can obscure the true extent of women's influence. Yet, they also offer tantalizing hints of the power women wielded behind closed doors. It's a bit like reading between the lines of a politician's speech. What's left unsaid is often as telling as what's declared. And let's not forget the impact of myth itself. The stories of goddesses and heroines, from Athene's wisdom to Penelope's loyalty, have shaped perceptions of gender roles for millennia. These myths, while fictional, reflect societal ideals and anxieties. The dichotomy between the divine and the mortal, the powerful and the subservient, underscores the complexities of gender dynamics in ancient Greece. So, what does all this mean for today's gender narratives? The ancient Greek experience serves as a reminder that women have always been integral to societal progress, despite the constraints imposed upon them. Their stories challenge us to rethink assumptions about gender roles, offering a nuanced perspective that goes beyond simplistic binaries. It's a call to recognize the contributions and agency of women throughout history, acknowledging both their struggles and their triumphs. As we close this chapter on ancient Greek women, let's carry forward the lessons learned. History is not just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry of human experiences, woven together by the lives of both the celebrated and the forgotten. The legacy of Greek women is a testament to their resilience and ingenuity, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, they shaped the world around them in profound ways. So, as the evening envelops the ancient city, and you find yourself drifting into the realm of dreams, remember this. The stories of Greek women are not just echoes from the past, but are threads that continue to interlace with our present, challenging us to see history not as a distant memory, but as a living narrative that still resonates today. And as you ponder these ancient lives, know that the legacy of these women, like the stars over the Acropolis, endures, lighting the way for future generations. If you ever thought your boss was a pain, spare a thought for Ferdinand Magellan, who hit the jackpot in workplace frustration back in the 1500s. Born in 1480 in the small Portuguese town of Sabrosa, Magellan wasn't exactly groomed for a life of fame and adventure. Nope, he was just a regular guy with a penchant for maps and the occasional daydream about far-off lands. Fast forward a couple of decades, and this ordinary dreamer was about to change the world, all while giving the biggest middle finger to his homeland. You see, Magellan started his career climbing the ranks in the Portuguese court, an environment that was about as cutthroat as a reality TV reunion. By his mid-20s, he was sailing to the fabled Spice Islands, today's Indonesia, where nutmeg and cloves were worth their weight in gold. And by gold, I mean a shocking 6,000% profit margin. These spices were the Bitcoin of the 16th century, folks. Magellan had seen the riches that lay beyond the horizon, and his brain was buzzing with ideas. But here's the kicker. Despite his experience and vision, the Portuguese crown wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for his big plans. The political climate in the early 1500s was tense, with Portugal and Spain locked in a high-stakes game of who can find the most lucrative trade route. Portugal had the east pretty well sewn up, thanks to Vasco da Gama and his merry band of explorers. So they weren't too keen on Magellan's radical idea to sail westward to reach the same destinations quicker and, crucially, cheaper. To add insult to injury, Magellan found himself underappreciated and sidelined, a classic case of not-in-my-backyard syndrome. It was like pitching a new social media platform to a room full of people still trying to figure out email. The Portuguese king, Manuel I, was not buying what Magellan was selling. In fact, he reportedly told Magellan to take a hike. Literally. It's like being told by your boss to take your revolutionary proposal and shove it. But Ferdinand was not the type to be deterred by a little royal snub. Oh no, he was more of a I'll show you kind of guy. So he packed up his dreams, along with a healthy dose of spite, and took his talents to Spain. Why Spain? Because King Charles I, a teenage monarch who had just inherited the throne, was itching to make his mark. Charles was eager to outdo his Iberian rivals, and perhaps more importantly, to fill his coffers with the kind of wealth that could buy a small country. Magellan's plan to reach the Spice Islands by sailing west was music to his ears. In 1518, Magellan found himself in the court of Charles I, pitching his plan with the enthusiasm of a door-to-door salesman. And it worked. Charles was sold. He not only bought into the idea, but gave Magellan his blessing, along with 5 ships and a crew. This was no small investment. The total cost of the expedition was around 8 million maravedis, a hefty sum that could buy you a fleet of ships or a lifetime supply of fancy hats. Magellan's gamble was paying off. But let's not get too romantic about it. This wasn't just about proving the world was round or reaching untapped riches. This was a high-stakes geopolitical maneuver, a chance for Spain to outflank Portugal in the race for trade dominance. Magellan's journey was as much about national pride and economic supremacy as it was about exploration. So here was Magellan, once a sidelined navigator in Portugal, now the captain of a Spanish fleet with a mandate to circumnavigate the globe. It's the stuff of legend, sure, but it was also a testament to Magellan's resilience and perhaps his sheer stubbornness. As he prepared to set sail, he was about to embark on a journey that would make him a household name, albeit one fraught with danger, mutiny, and a lot of salty sea air. But that's a tale for another day. For now, let's just appreciate the audacity of a man who turned a royal snub into a world-changing voyage. So, with 5 ships under his belt and a mission that would make even the boldest explorer break into a cold sweat, Magellan was ready to take on the world, literally. But before we dive into the high seas, let's rewind a bit and focus on what it took to get this voyage off the ground. Spoiler alert, it wasn't just about charisma and a swashbuckling spirit. First up, let's talk numbers. The expedition was a costly affair, ringing the cash register at 8 million maravedis. That's enough to fund a small army, or perhaps buy a year's supply of the finest Spanish wine. But hey, King Charles, I was convinced this was a worthy investment. In 1519, they weren't just throwing coins into a wishing well. They were betting on a new world order, with Spain at the helm. This was about economic dominance, baby, and those spices weren't going to collect themselves. Now let's chat ships. We're talking about the Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago. Not exactly the names you'd expect for a fleet of world changers, but they did the trick. These weren't luxury liners. They were hardy vessels, designed to withstand the unpredictable tantrums of the ocean. Think more sturdy workhorse, and less cruise ship with a cocktail bar. The flagship, Trinidad, was a proud carrack, while the others were smaller caravels. These ships were the space shuttles of the 16th century, carrying dreams of wealth and glory across uncharted waters. And then there was the crew. A ragtag bunch of about 270 men from all corners of Europe, each with their own story, baggage, and questionable life choices. Not exactly the Avengers, but they were what Magellan had to work with. These men ranged from seasoned sailors to landlubbers looking for a paycheck, with a healthy mix of adventurers, fugitives, and the odd nobleman in search of redemption or exile, or both. You could say it was the original Survivor cast, minus the immunity idols. But enough about the ships and crew. Let's get to the real nitty-gritty, logistics. Stocking a fleet for an uncertain journey across unknown seas was no small feat. This wasn't your average camping trip. The supply list read like a medieval doomsday prepper's dream. Barrels of wine, salted meat, hardtack biscuits, beans, and of course, enough gunpowder to make a pirate blush. They packed so much salt that it could make a pretzel factory jealous. Fresh water was a luxury, and scurvy, the sailor's arch-nemesis, was a constant spectre. Forget vitamin C gummies. These guys were lucky to get anything that wasn't pickled or dried beyond recognition. Managing expectations was another beast altogether. It's one thing to set sail with visions of spices and gold, but when you're weeks into a voyage with no land in sight, morale tends to take a nosedive. Magellan had to be part captain, part motivational speaker, and part crisis manager. Imagine convincing a ship full of hungry, seasick men that this was all going according to plan. It's like keeping a classroom of sugar-fueled toddlers in check, only with more mutiny and less nap time. And let's not gloss over the political tension bubbling beneath the surface. Remember, Spain and Portugal weren't exactly hosting joint cookouts. Magellan, a Portuguese defector leading a Spanish fleet, was a walking diplomatic incident waiting to happen. Loyalties were as fluid as the ocean waves, and trust was about as hard to find as a decent cappuccino on a 16th century ship. As they set sail on September 20, 1519, from Seville, the anticipation was palpable. These men were on the cusp of history, though they probably would have settled for a decent meal and a swift voyage. Magellan wasn't just steering ships. He was navigating the murky waters of human ambition, fear, and the relentless pursuit of glory. So there we have it. 5 ships, 270 men, and one audacious plan to circumnavigate the globe. As they left the familiar shores behind, they were propelled by a mix of hope, desperation, and the kind of stubbornness that makes history, or at least a good story. They weren't just chasing the horizon, they were redefining it. But as they would soon discover, the seas had a few surprises in store, and not all of them involved sunny skies and gentle breezes. The real adventure was only just beginning, and it was about to get wild. As the fleet sailed away from the comforting shoreline, the men were filled with a mix of hope and dread, like students on the first day of a semester without a syllabus. The Atlantic stretched before them, vast and uncharted, a blank canvas with plenty of potential for disaster. Magellan, with his unshakable determination and a gaze that could probably melt icebergs, was steering not just 5 ships, but the course of history. If only he knew the kind of chaos and comedy that awaited him. First up, the Atlantic Ocean, which was less of a friendly sea and more of a moody giant, with a penchant for surprise storms and currents that seemed to defy logic. It was the kind of place where compasses threw a tantrum and navigation was as much guesswork as it was science. Picture this: a fleet of wooden ships bobbing along, guided by stars that were often obscured by clouds, and a captain who was determined to reach a place he wasn't even sure existed. It was like trying to drive across the country with a map from a cereal box. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The real fun began when the fleet reached the coast of South America. By March 1520, after months of battling the Atlantic's unpredictable temperament, they arrived at Port St. Julian in what is now Argentina. This was supposed to be a pit stop, a chance to regroup and resupply. Instead, it turned into a scene straight out of a soap opera. It turns out, keeping 270 men in line on a long voyage with dwindling supplies is about as easy as herding cats on a sugar high. Enter the mutiny. Yes, you heard that right. A good old-fashioned mutiny, because if there's one thing sailors can't resist, it's a chance to overthrow authority. The officers of several ships, fed up with Magellan's leadership and the seemingly endless voyage, decided it was time for a change. Their plan: take control of the fleet and head back to Spain, where wine flowed freely and mutineers could, presumably, find new jobs as landlocked rebels. Magellan, however, was not one to let a little insubordination ruin his day. With a mix of strategic cunning and, let's face it, ruthlessness, he quashed the rebellion. How, you ask? By employing the age-old tactic of divide and conquer. He convinced some of the crew to stay loyal, secured the flagship Trinidad, and basically said, "Not on my watch," all while executing a couple of ringleaders to drive the point home. It was harsh, but effective. Mutiny may have sounded romantic on paper, but in reality it was a quick way to end up on the wrong side of a sword. The lesson here: never underestimate a man with a plan and a fleet at his fingertips. Magellan managed to keep the expedition on track, but not without leaving a few ghosts behind. The eerie silence of Port St. Julian served as a reminder that the sea wasn't the only adversary they faced. Human ambition and fear were just as formidable, and Magellan knew it. He was playing a high-stakes game of chess on a board with missing pieces, and every move counted. As the fleet resumed its journey, the stakes were higher than ever. Their next challenge was the Strait of Magellan, a treacherous passage that would make even the most seasoned sailor break into a cold sweat. Narrow and winding, it was the maritime equivalent of threading a needle while blindfolded. But Magellan was unfazed. He moved through the strait with the precision of a surgeon, navigating the labyrinthine channels with a focus that left no room for error. Emerging on the other side, the fleet entered the Pacific Ocean. The name itself, derived from the Latin word pacificus, meaning peaceful, was a cruel joke. The Pacific was a sprawling expanse of water that seemed to go on forever, and it was anything but tranquil. For months, the fleet drifted, driven by winds that were as capricious as they were gentle. Supplies dwindled, and the men were soon hit with the grim spectre of scurvy. Without fresh provisions, the sailors were left gnawing on leather and praying for land. The ocean was a silent antagonist, vast and unforgiving, and each day felt like a battle against the elements. It was during this time that Magellan's leadership was truly tested. He had to keep morale afloat while the ship seemed intent on sinking. The men were weary, their spirits as battered as the hulls of their vessels. Yet Magellan, with his unyielding resolve and a knack for seeing the silver lining in a storm cloud, kept them moving forward. He was a master of motivation, rallying his men with promises of the riches that lay beyond the horizon. Sure, it was a little like promising a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow, but sometimes belief is the strongest currency. As they pressed on, the fleet finally sighted land in the form of the Mariana Islands. It was like stumbling upon an oasis in a desert, a welcome reprieve from the relentless ocean. The men, exhausted and half-starved, were eager to trade with the islanders for fresh food and water. But in a twist that could only happen on an expedition like this, they were met with resistance. The locals, understandably wary of strange ships and even stranger men, were not exactly rolling out the welcome mat. Magellan's diplomatic skills were put to the test yet again. This time he managed to secure provisions through a mix of barter and, when necessary, a show of force. It was a delicate balance, but one that kept the fleet moving. The Pacific may have been vast and unpredictable, but Magellan was proving to be just as formidable. With their supplies replenished, the fleet continued on its journey toward the Spice Islands. The end was in sight, yet the challenges were far from over. Magellan's voyage was a testament to the power of human determination, a reminder that history is often shaped by those who refuse to give up, even when the odds are stacked against them. As the fleet sailed on, facing new trials and triumphs, Magellan's legacy was already being written. He was a man driven by vision and ambition, unafraid to tackle the unknown in pursuit of a dream. The journey was far from over, and the seas still held secrets yet to be uncovered. But for now, the fleet pressed on, guided by the stars and the unwavering spirit of a captain who refused to let the world remain a mystery. As the fleet drifted further into the Pacific, the men soon realized that the so-called peaceful ocean was more of a cruel joke than a promise. The Pacific was like that friend who promises a relaxing weekend getaway and then strands you in a mosquito-infested swamp. For 3 grueling months, the men endured an unending expanse of water with no sight of land, no fresh food, and a dwindling supply of what passed for drinkable water. If you thought your last road trip was rough, imagine it without GPS, gas stations, or granola bars. Scurvy, that notorious party crasher of naval adventures, made its grand entrance. Caused by a lack of vitamin C, scurvy is the kind of disease that starts with fatigue and bleeding gums, and escalates to something out of a horror movie, with teeth falling out and old wounds reopening. It was a grim reminder that these men were relying on salted meats and hardtack biscuits, foods as fresh as a long-forgotten fridge mystery. Sadly, they didn't have the benefit of knowing that a few oranges could stave off this nightmare. Meanwhile, the men's mental state was as frayed as a pair of thrift store jeans. The endless blue stretched their nerves to breaking point, tensions simmered, and arguments sparked over the smallest slights. Imagine being stuck in an elevator with your least favorite coworker, times 100, and you'll get the idea. The promise of glory and riches that had buoyed their spirits back in Seville now seemed like a cruel mirage. Yet through it all, Magellan remained the unyielding fulcrum of the expedition. His leadership was a masterclass in perseverance. He was the kind of guy who, when faced with a disaster, shrugged it off and told his men to keep their eyes on the prize. A lesser man might have turned back, but for Magellan, retreat was not an option. He was navigating not just the ocean, but the complex web of human emotions, fear, and ambition that threatened to unravel the mission at any moment. Finally, in March 1521, salvation appeared in the form of the Philippines. But while the islands promised respite, they also harbored unforeseen dangers. The fleet anchored at the island of Cebu, and Magellan, ever the diplomat, made contact with the local ruler, Raja Humaban. In a move that was part goodwill gesture, part strategic alliance, Magellan converted Humaban and his followers to Christianity. It was a bold move, akin to convincing a stranger to join your book club on the first meeting. But here's where the tale takes a tragic turn. Magellan, emboldened by his diplomatic success, got a little too involved in local politics. He pledged to support Humaban in a skirmish against a rival chieftain, Lapu-Lapu, on the nearby island of Mactan. Cue ominous music, because this decision would prove fateful. On April 27, 1521, Magellan and his men found themselves facing Lapu-Lapu's warriors. The ensuing Battle of Mactan was a clash of cultures and egos, and it did not end well for our intrepid explorer. With a mix of hubris and underestimation of his opponents, Magellan led his men into a trap. The Spanish armor, which was perfect for deflecting arrows and swords, was not so great when you were wading through knee-deep water, making them sitting ducks for Lapu-Lapu's nimble fighters. Magellan was struck down in the skirmish, a victim of his own ambition and the unpredictability of human conflict. His death was both a sobering end to his journey and a stark reminder that no amount of strategy can account for every variable. He had sailed halfway around the world only to fall on the shores of a small island, a testament to the capricious nature of fate. Despite this tragic end, Magellan had already etched his name into history. His vision of a westward route to the Spice Islands had set the wheels of exploration in motion, and his determination had brought the fleet further than anyone could have imagined. Though he did not live to complete the journey, his legacy was carried forward by his surviving crew. In the wake of Magellan's death, the expedition faced a leadership crisis. The men were now adrift not just physically, but metaphorically, as they grappled with the loss of their captain. Yet they were not ready to give up. Leadership passed to Juan Sebastián Elcano, a Basque navigator who took the helm with the kind of resolve that would have made Magellan proud. Elcano was tasked with the unenviable job of leading the remaining crew through the final leg of their journey, a perilous path that would ultimately see them complete the first circumnavigation of the globe. The fleet was whittled down to a single ship, the Victoria, by the time they reached the Spice Islands. The men, though weary and battered, finally achieved the dream that had set them on this epic voyage. They had reached the fabled islands, laden with cloves and nutmeg, those elusive treasures that had driven empires to the brink of war. But the journey was far from over. As they set sail for Spain, the Victoria was laden with spices, enough to make the voyage financially worthwhile despite the staggering losses. It was a bittersweet victory, one tainted by the knowledge of their captain's fate and the hardships they had endured. Returning home, they faced the treacherous Indian Ocean, the Cape of Good Hope, and the long journey back to Europe. The Victoria limped into the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda on September 6, 1522, almost 3 years after the expedition had set out. Of the original 270 men, only 18 returned, their bodies and minds marked by the trials they had faced. The voyage had taken a toll, but it had also carved a path through the unknown, proving that the world was indeed round and that the seas could be conquered. Magellan's expedition may have ended in tragedy, but his name became synonymous with exploration and human tenacity. He had dared to dream big, and in doing so, changed the map of the world. His journey was a tale of ambition, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge, a story that continues to inspire dreamers and explorers to this day. As the dust settled and the world began to comprehend the magnitude of what had been achieved, Magellan's name was etched into the annals of history. His journey had not only opened new trade routes, but had also expanded the boundaries of human understanding. The Pacific, once a vast and terrifying unknown, was now a navigable ocean, linking continents and cultures in a way that had once seemed impossible. Yet the story of Magellan's expedition was far from over. The ramifications of his voyage would ripple through the centuries, shaping the geopolitical landscape and sparking a new age of exploration. As we look back on his journey, it serves as a powerful reminder of the human spirit's capacity for courage and curiosity, a testament to the explorers who dared to challenge the limits of their world. And so, the saga of Ferdinand Magellan continues, a tale of triumph and tragedy that captures the imagination and invites us to ponder the mysteries that lie beyond the horizon. The journey may have ended, but the story lives on, a beacon for all who seek to push the boundaries of what is known and venture into the great unknown. And so, as the Victoria returned to Spain, hauling more than just spices, but the weight of an entire expedition's worth of stories, it was clear that this was not just a tale of maritime derring-do. Nope, this was a seismic shift in the global trade game, the kind that makes empires salivate and accountants reach for their quills. The Victoria, the last ship standing, was like the battered athlete who limps across the finish line, victorious but forever changed. The crew, a mere 18 survivors from the original 270, were the walking embodiment of resilience, their bodies and minds etched with the memories of hardship, loss, and unexpected triumph. Upon its return to Seville on September 6, 1522, the Victoria was laden with a cargo of spices that were worth their weight in gold, or, more accurately, enough to offset the staggering expenses of the voyage and still leave a hefty profit. We're talking about 26 tons of cloves, nutmeg, and other exotica, the kind of haul that would make even the most seasoned trader drool. The spices fetched a price that was 25 times their weight in European currency, making the expedition not just a triumph of exploration, but a financial coup for Spain. In the high-stakes world of 16th-century geopolitics, this was akin to striking oil or finding a treasure chest at the end of a rainbow. But let's not get too romantic. The reality was far grimmer than the ledger's black ink might suggest. The expedition had cost the lives of over 250 men, including its charismatic leader, Ferdinand Magellan. The voyage had been a crucible of human endurance, a test of will that had broken many before it finally bent to Elcano's leadership. The men who returned were not greeted with parades, but rather a mix of awe and disbelief. Their stories of survival, treachery, and discovery were the stuff of legend, yet they carried the scars, both literal and metaphorical, of their journey across the globe. As for Magellan, the man who started it all, well, his name would become synonymous with exploration, even if he didn't live to complete his dream. It was a bitter irony that the man who set out to circumnavigate the globe ended his journey on a distant beach, felled by the very forces he sought to understand. Yet in death he achieved a form of immortality, his name forever linked to the age of discovery. History would remember him as the visionary who dared to challenge the status quo, a man whose stubbornness was matched only by his audacity. The aftermath of the expedition rippled through the Spanish court and beyond. King Charles I, who had taken a gamble on Magellan's wild westward plan, found himself at the helm of a new world order. The successful circumnavigation not only validated Spain's claim to the Spice Islands, but also opened the door to further exploration. It was a geopolitical power move of the highest order, one that made Portugal's monopoly on eastern routes look like yesterday's news. However, let's not gloss over the reality check. The romantic notion of exploration was often overshadowed by the brutal truth of imperialism. The quest for spices and riches was not just a journey of discovery, but a harbinger of the darker side of colonization. The indigenous peoples encountered along the way were viewed more as obstacles or resources, an uncomfortable truth that history prefers to sidestep in favor of tales of heroism and adventure. In the grand tapestry of history, Magellan's voyage was a thread of both triumph and tragedy. It highlighted humanity's insatiable curiosity and capacity for endurance while exposing the harsh realities of ambition and conquest. The expedition had opened new trade routes, reshaped global commerce, and expanded the known world, but it also came at a hefty human cost. The romantic allure of the journey often eclipses the grim details, yet both are integral to understanding the legacy left behind. As we reflect on Magellan's legacy, it's clear that history is often kinder to its heroes than reality. The tale of the Victoria's return is one of perseverance and discovery, but it's also a reminder of the complexities that lie beneath the surface of great achievements. Magellan's dream had been realized not by him, but by those who followed his lead and pushed beyond the horizon. The world had grown smaller, yet its mysteries had only deepened. In the end, Magellan's story is a testament to the human spirit's relentless pursuit of the unknown. It's a narrative filled with daring exploits, grueling hardships, and transformative discoveries. As we look back on this chapter of exploration, we're reminded that the journey is often as significant as the destination. Magellan may not have lived to see his dream fulfilled, but his legacy endures, inspiring future generations to imagine what lies beyond the edge of the map. And there you have it, folks, a saga that encompasses the heights of ambition and the depths of despair, with a side of cloves and nutmeg to spice things up. Magellan's voyage was more than just a circumnavigation. It was a redefinition of the world as it was known. As the Victoria sailed into history, it carried with it the lessons and legacies of those who dared to dream big and sail even bigger. The tale of Magellan and his expedition is a reminder that while history may be written by the victors, it's lived by the survivors.